for it, but I could sort of call it the sociopath trap.
You have like this cognitive way of understanding things, and then you have like this emotional way of understanding things. And I didn't realize that these were two different things until I had very short like mental health bouts post doing lots of mushrooms. And something that I realized was that I don't know how you bridge a cognitive understanding with an emotional understanding. So I had like very small bouts of weird, something akin to maybe general anxiety disorders or major depressive disorder, where I could like read things and my brain still worked. I could understand stuff, but on an emotional level, I was like in a different place, and I couldn't do anything to change that.
Almost always follows the big three, which is God's, alien, and government. People trying to take...
I didn't even know that. That is so true, though.
I emailed you because I was listening to the conversation, and I hate to say I'm a fan of yours.
Okay.
It was a little hard to listen to, though, because it sounded like a bunch of folks who were doing their best guessing, and everybody was guessing really good. But ultimately, it was kind of like missing the point. It's like, that's just not really what it looks like. And he had some strong points, but, just kind of quick background. I worked in mental health for about 12 years.
Okay.
Been doing drug and alcohol counseling the past 5. Went to grad school. And somewhere in that chunk of time, of the past 12 years, I've done crisis responding work for about 3 years. And that has typically been with folks 17 and under, though I work alongside a team, totally different organizations, but there's another team that does 18 and up.
Jeez. Okay, wait. So let me understand. You do drug and alcohol counseling for 17 and under?
Oh, sorry. Well, yeah. So drug and alcohol 17 and under, but therapy services for adults. So I'm something called dual diagnosis.
Okay.
And I suppose I'll do therapy with kids if they come my way. I kind of prefer 14 and up for myself. But the crisis response that I do specifically is for 17 and under, and that's like on top of the other duties. That's like a separate thing that you can do if you want to.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, where do you want to start as the expert?
Sure. So the part that got me was nobody mentioned anything about non-emergency police, and maybe that was intentional. And I tried to sort of listen back to it, but there wasn't a whole lot about like non-emergency police.
Nope, I don't believe anybody brought any of that up.
Yeah, so a lot of folks call for non-emergency police, for non-emergency things. And I tried to get some good data on this, and I just couldn't. The best I could sort of find, like, nationally was sort of this idea that, like, about 30 or 40% of calls that come in through 911 are non-emergency. And like you just mentioned in the last thing, the dispatcher will sort of, do that.
Were you the one that told me that?
I don't think I was. I didn't actually give you much info.
Oh, okay, gotcha. There are so many. Every time I have these conversations, like so many experts like will email me in their field to give me like their feedback. That's why my like position changes over time on things. So I get people like you will email me. And yeah, somebody emailed me, and that was their line at the end. They were like, "Hey, when you call 911, don't ever let anybody say that you're calling the police. When you call 911, what you're actually getting is a dispatcher."
Which was perfect, which was so helpful to hear. I was like, hell yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't even think of that at the time. I was so dumb. The email was, also, he said the only phone number available is the cops, which is dumb because 911 doesn't call a cop. It calls an emergency dispatcher who is then qualified to dispatch the correct emergency or non-emergency services. So what you're talking about, the non-emergency thing, yeah?
Right, exactly that. So, and just kind of explaining a little bit what a crisis call is this going to be like too rough to hear it from the kid's perspective? Is that kind of too far off your point? I have a sense of what adult calls look like as well.
No, you can, whatever we're here.
Yeah, I just wanted to run that down real quick.
Go for it.
So, for the most part, crisis calls are usually pretty boring. Like, it will be something like you get a call and it'll be like, hey, my son or daughter, they're beating the crap out of the house. They're kicking the crap out of their siblings. We have a rough time. And here's where your strong point came in. That was awesome. We say, okay, well, are they physically violent? Are they armed? Anything like that? Because if so, please hang up and call the cops. And then when they say, like, no, they don't have a weapon or anything, they're just really escalated. Or they were escalated early, but they're starting to calm down, and we're kind of worried about what's going to happen. That's when we kind of jump in and we say, like, okay, we'll try to talk to them or whatever. They might refuse over the phone, or things are too hot. So then we'll show up in person and kind of try to talk them down a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and I guess would it be helpful to kind of like identify like what an intervention for that might be?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so intervention might just be like, what do we need to get through the night?
Hmm.
It's very short-sighted. It's not like services. Um,
Or actually, wait, let me back up. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm sorry. This is a good question. So, in a
yeah,
situation where, let's say you hypothetically get a call, and it is
uh-huh,
just like we have like an older child who's having problems. Say it's only a mother in the household, so they don't know if they can
perfect.
get. Yeah. If you were to show up, but the child doesn't have any weapons. They're not like
Yep.
ultra physically destructive, just like something more than rambunctious, but not like lethal. Okay, something in between that, right?
Yeah.
Would you bring normally like a police officer to those situations, or would you just show up
No,
as one social worker? Yeah,
we would show up and we would call the police if we needed to, if it sort of escalated from there.
gotcha. Okay.
And the big point is like, and I have been trained in doing restraints. It
Mm-hmm.
is not a part of this job.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it. It's a bit superfluous, and fortunately, I haven't really had to use restraints. But there, in systems of care, there's something called like a subacute facility, which is what you might think of as like I don't know, like your typical movie mental health hospital where the orderlies are jumping on folks and all that.
Sure.
Obviously, they don't do that. They use, approved holds, and I've been trained on those. And honestly, I've only ever been a part of one hold,
Mm-hmm.
because that program was like next to ours. But we don't do holds.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do any of that stuff. The big training is just about like getting out of there. Like, how can you put a door between you and the person who's sort of like threatening,
Mm-hmm.
and then calling the police pretty quickly, letting them know that you're a crisis responder. And I think that that's sort of a piece that was maybe missed because nobody knew about it. That like we talk to each other, like agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Like police are going to respond more quickly to a crisis worker than they might with somebody else,
Sure.
because we're kind of doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And for what it's worth, hate to be a shitter here. I mean, I really like the police in our town. They've been pretty
Mm-hmm.
nice and professional and do a great job. But I live in a very white place,
Mm-hmm.
and that can also be why crisis services can be as successful as they are. Just to name that out loud, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, so I think the other thing that was sort of missed, which you know much about like budgeting, like the idea of like the biggest mistake that people make in budgeting is they don't ever anticipate making more money. Like they just like, oh, I'm gonna make 15 bucks an hour forever. When we
Um,
talk,
are you talking about like for individuals?
yeah, for individuals, like when an individual makes a budget, there's sort of a sense of like a mistake people can make is they don't plan on like, well, 4 or 5 years from now, you're gonna be making quite a bit more money than you're making now.
That's interesting. I'm sure there are ways where that pops up, but
Hmm.
I feel like the bigger problem, maybe this is just from what I've seen, is people are really bad about planning on making future money. And
Yeah.
that they'll assume that they'll have more than they'll have. Or if they get a raise, they're very, very, very quick to up their bills, their monthly bills, onto whatever new financial raise they got, or even if the money is a temporary thing. So I've
Oh.
seen, and this is the worst thing about like
Hmm.
working in these areas, because even if I was like working poor, I always had like a good education, right? The worst,
Okay.
worst, 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 worst time for poor people is fucking April when that tax return money comes in. Yeah,
Yeah.
motherfuckers, they won't even take $3,000 and go buy a TV. They'll take
Mhm.
$3,000 and buy a new living room set and a TV that they have to make future payments on with money they don't have. I feel
Yeah.
like people have a lot of problem with stuff like that. Ugh. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
God damn, that's a good point. Well, shit. Well, where I was going to go with
Oh
that
yeah,
is
you
the
go. Yeah,
idea
Timmy,
that
yeah.
when we have these crisis services in place, there
Mm-hmm.
is a word of mouth factor.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is sort of like a calibration period where it's sort of like, well, who do I call? Like, how do I know if this rises to the level of 911
Mm-hmm.
versus crisis worker versus just non-emergency police?
Mm-hmm.
And I sent you something in the Discord just now. This is the program that's sort of like, the darling of crisis workers. It's called Cahoots,
Mm-hmm.
based out of Eugene, Oregon. And you can kind of see like their utilization rates over time,
Mm-hmm.
where like I don't know, I guess it's on page 3. It sort of starts out as in 2014 they're getting just under 10,000 calls a year.
Oh, I'm seeing it. Yeah.
Right, by 2019, they're getting almost 25,000 calls.
Mm-hmm.
And they respond to about 20% of the police calls. Well, so 17%. And on their data points, they also highlight that of those 24,000 calls, about 250 of them escalated to the police being involved.
Gotcha.
So as these services kind of get off the ground and people know that they exist, they tend to try to use them,
Hmm.
which is another important thing. But just to bring it home, like that liability piece is everything. And there are things where if I had to be liable for them or my team had to be liable for them, like absolutely would not do it.
Hmm.
Like that's way too much risky business.
Yeah.
Because especially with mental health, like that's your licensure on the line.
Sure.
That's not just getting in trouble. That's like, do you ever get to do this job again
Hmm.
if you mess it up? Which, no thanks. That's kind of a bit too spicy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not losing your job sucks kind of, but it's not even the job loss that's the worst part. It's the fact that you've invested years in your life training for it that are now
Yeah,
essentially completely worthless.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, geez Louise. I got a BA in psychology, and then I didn't get my master's degree for like 8 or 10 years later, something like that. And it's a pretty useless degree. Like, for those who want to do it, go for it.
Hmm.
Like, if you want to pursue mental health, it's a degree in a related field. But as far as like job prospects, you can't do a whole lot with it.
Yeah.
Um, Other than get a master's degree later, maybe you want to teach, maybe you want to do research, in which case you're fine. But
Hmm.
a lot of folks who do that want to do counseling, and that's why they pursue that degree.
Sure.
Um, so anyway, there's a piece of that one. And yeah, I'm trying to think if I forgot anything about that. Uh, any other kind of questions about that stuff?
Um, Not that I can think of. No.
Yeah. Um, I think the other thing that I just wanted to bring up as well as I took some notes a little bit is
Hmm.
I I do not want to get into the Rittenhouse stuff. I'm kind of treating this as like
Sure.
folks can maybe recognize my voice, and so I don't want to say anything that I wouldn't be comfortable with everybody who knows me knowing. But you've kind of spoken to this idea with some of the Rittenhouse
Hmm.
stuff coming out, and and there's probably a better name for it, but I could sort of call it the sociopath trap, where we just sort of automatically assume that everybody is a sociopath.
Oh yeah. Sure.
Like, what are you gonna do when you show up and you encounter the sociopath who's like ready to murder you?
Which is so annoying because the
Yeah,
entire fucking body of psychology, I am not aware of any fucking large or small psych experiment or study that has ever been done that's like, we did this study and we found out at the end, wow, none of our subjects were influenced by this. Wow, all of our subjects were free thinking,
yeah,
divinely inspired people, and we
right.
weren't able to influence them with these slightest social factors at all, right? Like, it's always completely the opposite. But yeah, but anytime something happens, this person is like a divine, like 100% in control of their destiny, completely
Yeah.
free will, the most evil, horrible person ever. It's very, very, very frustrating. Yeah.
And it may be the case that indeed somebody is like a sociopath, been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, doing
Hmm.
very bad things. But it's sort of like, if that's the case, you got the math problem correct, but you used the wrong formula.
Sure.
Like, realistically, probably a lot more things are true. And I don't necessarily think it sort of behooves us as a society or individuals to just automatically assume that, like, nope, this person loves hurting people.
Hmm.
And I want to be very clear, like I'm not trying to defend Kyle Rittenhouse here. I'm not engaging in those
Sure.
subreddits. It's just it's popped up.
And my
So
guess would be, without, I
yeah,
don't even have the numbers in front of me, but my guess would be that it's probably still like a single digit percentage of ASPD people that actually act out like in outwardly violent ways that are like committing
oh
crimes and stuff. I doubt it's
yeah,
like 80% of people with ASPD are out there like murdering people or whatever, because we'd see these numbers
because
being
if you
pointed
do
out.
that, you're in prison.
Yeah.
Like it sort of works itself out. And I've had the opportunity to work with folks in prison and all that stuff. And well, this is totally anecdotal. I worked in residential treatment for a long time, so kind of a big revolving door. And then I've worked with a lot of folks in the community.
Hmm.
So I've probably worked with a few thousand people at this point, in some capacity or another. And I've met maybe three that it's like, okay, yeah, they might be there.
Hmm.
Like they like to hurt animals. They get off on, pain, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But it's just incredibly rare. Usually
Yeah.
it's just a tremendous amount of trauma, and trauma makes people do really funky stuff.
Mhm.
That's not usually the best.
I say this through when I talk about. I guess I'm curious what your feedback or your thought is on
Sure.
this. A lot of the times we talk about, especially on this stream,
Yeah.
emotionally manipulative people sometimes,
Oh
or
God.
people that can be abusers. And I try to
Hmm.
be really careful when I talk about this, or I try to be really precise. It's I'm actually completely anecdotal here and just my lived
Yeah.
experience. So maybe the research doesn't agree with me, but when people act in ways that are emotionally manipulative or emotionally abusive, I don't believe a lot of people think that these people spend a great deal of time kind of like plotting out their evils.
Right.
When in reality, I think it's more like, let's say you have a person who knows that if they cry, they'll get what they want. It's not
Yeah.
like they're thinking like, okay, after he does this, I'm going to start crying and I'm going to get what I want. It's more just like you have a set of learned behaviors that provoke certain responses and you just kind of like default to them. But it's not this
Hmm.
highly manipulative, sociopathic, like I'm planning all this stuff. It's just people, especially like some abusive people, just kind of like fall into a pattern of behaviors that like manipulate people around. It's not like the most cognition. It's not like this ultra cognitive process where you're super thinking about every time you're doing it or whatever. I guess.
Exactly. Like there's sort of like a conditioned response to it. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know what's what, but I notice that when I do these things, I get these results.
Hmm.
And man, yeah, I, what I will tell folks in session sometime is like, let's bring back the dick. Like, bring back the jerk. Like, this person is mean.
Hmm.
This person's a real jerk.
Oh yeah, because
This
like
person's not nice.
when we talk on, especially on Twitter, even
Hmm.
more, or maybe a little bit more specifically, something that I get so frustrated by is there are no more dicks or assholes. There are no more
Yeah,
mean people. There are only abusers, right? Like all of the language
exactly.
becomes so much more tuned up. And it's like,
Hmm.
was that person mean to you? No, that person was abusive. And it's like, well, damn,
Exactly.
like, were they really abusive? Like, well, what do you mean by that, right? That person ignored you. That's not ghosting. That's abuse. It's like, well, wait, hold on. Is that really abuse? Like, yeah, people are very quick they've co opted like all of the, I don't know if you call it the therapist vernacular or like all the domestic
Right.
victim vernacular. And now it applies to every single social situation you're in. It's like, geez.
Well, and I took some notes, and
Oh,
this is kind of going through things. Like we don't have to go through any of these topics. If you got to you kick me out whenever you
yeah,
want.
whatever you want, go
But
for it.
it's kind of going through some of these things about like yes, and I think when folks are kind of maybe new to psychology, like newer students, that kind of stuff,
Uh huh.
it can be really exciting to learn a term that maybe explains something you've been thinking or feeling your whole life.
Uh huh.
And so it's just very like freeing to be able to say like, ah, yes, this thing that really bothered me when I was a kid, that actually has a name, and that name is like emotional abuse
Uh huh.
or stonewalling or some such other thing.
Sure.
Or this person's a narcissist. When in what they're going off is like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, they don't like it when people are critical of them.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, who doesn't accept feedback? Somebody who doesn't like you.
Yeah.
Like
I
that's a person who might not accept your feedback.
and I don't
Nothing to
know.
do with narcissism.
I don't know if I would blame society at large or if I would blame psychology for this. But I really want. This is actually a huge criticism that I have of psychology.
Hmm.
I wish they would have
Oof.
invented or created a whole new set of language or a whole new set of words or adjectives rather than either. I don't know if psychology borrowed from common vernacular first or if common
Hmm.
vernacular borrowed from psychology because I think it is actually so incredibly damaging. I hate the fact that like major depressive disorder, it has depression, that people call it depression because it's not. It's not at all.
Sure.
It's totally not even related. It's a totally different thing than feeling depressed. And like it would be like calling like one thing like a chair and another thing like the color blue. Like they're so different, and it frustrates me so much that like NPD, narcissistic personality disorder,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't really have much to do with just being narcissistic or having a big ego, right? Like there's the diagnostic criteria is more specific than that. There's plenty
Yeah.
of people
People
that
miss
are
it
yeah, there are plenty of
a
people that are
lot.
narcissistic that aren't NPD. They don't have that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's the idea of like traits versus diagnosis. Like all
Hmm.
of us might have a personality disorder trait
Sure.
if we are angry enough
For sure.
or amped up enough or if life has sort of taken a dump on us enough.
Hmm.
The piece with MPD that really cracks me up is there's a huge component to that of grandiosity.
Sure.
You feel like you deserve to be with the upper crust of society. Good things ought to come with you. Like I know it's going to happen, and that's often just missed for like this person won't accept my feedback or my criticism.
Hmm.
Heretofore, they're a narcissist,
Yeah.
and it's really problematic. And what you're talking about with the language piece, so like tons of therapeutic models. Every therapist has their favorite, whether you know it or not. Um, I encourage folks to ask them, like, what kind of therapist are you? What kind of work do you do?
Hmm.
My big four, like I'm a big narrative therapies person. I also do DBT and a little bit of internal family systems. So I'll kind of swing in there.
Okay.
And the narrative therapy piece is sort of like, what is the story you tell of your situation?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you relate to that story? So, like, something really bad happens to me, and is the story like I'm damaged goods, or is the story like I'm a walking miracle?
Mm-hmm.
And so, when we have really intense charged language, that very much colors the narrative. That very much colors the story in a way that could be helpful for some, but could also be really unhelpful for other people.
Sure.
And I think you bring that example up a lot of times, like for somebody who's like truly experiencing pretty heavily. I don't know. It's like the meme with the guy from what is it, Breaking Bad? Like, we are not the same.
Yeah.
Like
Gus Springer. Yeah.
yeah, like I use this term because I was essentially mentally tortured for years. You use this term because you're sad,
Yeah.
and I'm not trying to take a dump on anybody's mental health here.
Mm-hmm.
It's just these are things that can be kind of unhelpful sometimes, and I mean, some of these terms, man, they sound cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like they sound badass to say out loud.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I think sometimes it feels a little like now this is super armchair psychology, right? But like you get this yeah, ironically enough, you get kind of like it feels validating to say that like an experience that you had was bad if you can give it like a really big label that brings with it a bunch more like serious kind of things, like, oh, like,
yeah,
I didn't just have shitty parents, like my parents were a combination of narcissistic personality disorder and all these other cluster B personality disorders, and they engaged in
right,
so much different abuse and traumatized, and I have triggers and PTSD, and it's like, damn, like, really, like,
yeah,
yeah, it gets a little frustrating sometimes when it seems like every single person on, and I'm kidding, online now, but like when every single person on Twitter
sure,
has like 6 different disorders, and all of these, of course, are undiagnosed, and they're not seeking treatments for anything, and it's like, Jesus Christ, like, but then they'll be on the flip side out there talking about all these diseases and conditions and stuff, and just saying stuff that's totally off the wall, like not true, and it's all very, 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 very frustrating.
yeah,
Not to get political, and I don't want to draw you in that direction, but like,
sure,
without saying whether or not Kyle Rittenhouse was right or wrong or anything, but I was very frustrated because everybody on Twitter, 80% of the people on Twitter are like, oh, I've got triggers and I've got trauma and PTSD and blah, 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 blah. Yet everybody on Twitter was so quick to look at, I don't know if you saw Kyle Rittenhouse have what looked to me kind of like a panic attack in court. And everybody's like, oh my God,
yeah,
it's fake. I can tell 100% it's fake, 100%. It's like, man, really? You really can just see
yeah,
that? Like, I don't know about that one, Chief. Like, especially if you claim to have all these triggers, all these traumas, like, you can just look at somebody and instantaneously know that they're faking crying. Like,
right.
yeah.
Well, and to I don't know, not to blow smoke up your ass, but I feel like that's kind of what has drawn me to your content a bit, is sort of this idea about like, philosophy is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Like having a personal sense of ethics, I think, is like harder than we might think. And a lot of times we don't necessarily recognize when it's sort of like, wait a second, I just said something way outside of my ethical framework, or
Mm-hmm.
I just said something way outside of my personal philosophy. Um, because yeah, like if you believe in toxic masculinity and that kind of stuff, you really ought not be playing into some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, grieving people can say bad stuff or say harmful things, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a little frustrating. It's hard to see.
No.
Yeah. Um. Damn. Sorry,
Wait, why? Okay.
Yeah. Go for it.
Well, now I'm just gonna pick your brain on everything. Why are psychology students so fucking crazy?
Haha.
Here,
Yeah.
here's what I get. You know what? Here's
Yeah.
here's what I think. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you're a psychologist, so I can use all the fucking words with you. Okay. You're
Yep.
familiar with confirmation bias, right?
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah. It feels to me like, and this is why I don't even trust myself. So I've wondered for a long time if I have ADHD. I don't know if I trust myself to go to a professional and talk to them, because my child has ADHD and I did so much reading on it. I don't know if I would trust myself not to just give the answers that I know I should be giving if I have ADHD, right? Because I feel like I've looked at like the diagnostic criteria and everything. Well, I know what I would
Sure.
need to say to get that right. I feel like it must
Yeah.
be so strange for psych students to start learning things. And here's like I took one psych class in my life, okay? It was, honest to God, the
Yeah.
best class I ever took in my life. It was an AP psych class in
Oh,
high
cool.
school, okay? It was so eye-opening for me. Oh my God. And the biggest thing that I took away from that psych class is actually the same I took away from philosophy, is it ultra undermined my confidence in my objectivity in the world. That's what it did. And I mean that in the best way possible. I was like, okay, I have so many biases that are functioning when I don't even fucking realize it. And it's good to be aware of that. I feel like so many psych students that I talk to go into psychology and they sound like what a person who has never studied psychology would start saying if they were introduced to psychology, which is like, I've learned three things. I can instantaneously diagnose your attachment pattern. I could psychoanalyze you. I can recommend you all these things. Like, bro, you've talked to this person for like 2 minutes. What the fuck is wrong with you? And they're like a year 4 psych student. Or there's somebody that graduated with their psych degree. They've got a BS or BS.
Sure.
Like, what the fuck? Why? Why do people do this?
Yeah, this might be disappointing or whatnot. I think it's exciting. I think there's
Sure.
certainly an excitement component, and that is kind of the idea. Like when you're working with somebody doing stuff, you have your set of theories based on your therapeutic models, and you end up getting very good at making predictions. And this person that you're working with, that you have a lot of respect for, they're an awesome person, they start doing things where it's like, aha, we kind of saw that coming.
Mm-hmm.
And what you don't realize is that that theory is just not very helpful to anybody other than you. And what happens, and I feel like what I've seen online a lot, is like, we got to let the world know. You have to tell everybody about this theory and how you formulated your plan and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk to a real person in life, like, I'll give a hypothetical here. This is not based on a real person, but I feel like,
Okay.
oh, your dad wasn't really around. And so, you will look to cling on to men and there's a certain profile, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to say that to somebody in real life, that's not helpful.
Yeah.
That does not help that person very much at all. And in times that I have done stuff like that, I'm oftentimes like, because I have made these mistakes, met with a response of like, okay, now what?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just not very helpful other than to like put in a book or gossip about it, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that part of it is that, and part of it is it's like when it comes to Dunning-Kruger, like there is a component of like if you know nothing about taxes and you watch a 10-minute video, that is very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is some stuff that is very helpful, but yeah, you don't know everything about people. And it's really important to have those experiences of one, somebody telling you to your face that you're not being very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And two, like coming out with some of that stuff and then realizing like, oh shit, we're not really going anywhere here. Like this is not what this person wanted to talk about.
Sure.
Um, so I think that those are some big pieces of it. Damn it, you said something else I'm not quite remembering now. That's what I get for not having the notepad.
Fuck. Yeah. Oh shit. I usually write notes down when I talk to people, so I don't forget.
Oh,
things.
you were saying that like these are the folks who seem to be like the least like aware of psychological biases. That's what you were talking about.
Oh yeah. So like, if I diagnose somebody,
Yeah.
eventually, like
Mhm.
that's all. Oh, I want to ask you another. I'll ask you a question about that later.
Yeah.
Like, is it helpful to give a diagnosis to a person? Something I have a lot of difficulty when I talk to some
Yeah.
people, and I even have this difficulty with myself actually. Where like, so I'll speak personally. As soon as I started studying a lot for my child for what ADHD was, involves a lot of things that I didn't know before, and
Yeah.
a lot of things that involve for reasons where I was like, oh, I can't have ADHD. Like I played StarCraft for 16 hours a day for 4 years. How the fuck can I have ADHD, right? I read a lot. I was like, oh shit, okay, hold on. Where it opened my eyes, and then I worry sometimes where it's like, okay, I want to sit down and I want to work on this thing. But like,
Yeah.
can I do it? Or like, is my ADHD going to keep me from doing it? I don't know if I'm becoming trapped by my own information, right? Like, and I wonder, and I worry sometimes, like, do I have the discipline to do this? Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't because I have ADHD. And then sometimes I'll talk to friends who they'll say something, and I never tell anybody this because I don't want to get into the argument, and it's not my place to say.
Sure.
But anytime I hear somebody say like, oh, I want to do this, or I could do this, but this is what it means because I am, I've got people that will say like, oh, I'm bipolar, or I have BPD, or I'm ASPD, or I can't do this, and like blah blah. It's like, well, fuck, wait, hold on. Now it sounds like you've learned this vernacular and now you've like trapped yourself with it. Is it helpful to have like, I can understand from a diagnostic point of view it could be helpful, but like,
Sure.
is it helpful to share this with patients, or what is your like stance or feeling on that?
I'm going to steal your ship from you. Are you ready?
Uh-oh.
Because you actually commented on this in a not a wholly unrelated thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you worded it in a really cool way, which is it was some video you did however long ago where you're talking about like knowledge and how valuable is knowledge.
Oh, as long as
And-
it gives you a helpful prescription, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so to me, like a diagnosis that involves no treatment plan is somewhat useless.
Mm-hmm.
Like there has to be like some idea about like this is what is going on and this is what we're going to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
And without that, it's not particularly helpful. And I would say that if what a person needs is a break and the diagnosis allows them to take a break, like I'm easily overwhelmed, so I could do this thing, but I will probably have a bad time. So I guess there can be some utility in that, but ultimately, I being a person who kind of also has ADHD, like embracing that has kind of been very helpful because it's allowed me to sort of learn like, well, this is actually how I learn better.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do these things, like this actually allows me to do the things that I want to do because I recognize that like I take in information a little bit different, or I might need to move, or shake my leg a lot,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that in order to stay focused. I mean, I'm playing Factorio right now, in part because it actually helps with the focus.
Gotcha.
Um, yeah, so yeah, but I kind of going to that piece as well. There's some stuff that folks have shared about mental health pieces,
Mm-hmm.
things about their diagnosis and stuff, where I've definitely wondered, like, how did you come to know that about yourself? If
Oh
somebody's like,
yeah, because it's like, and this is like, it's
mm-hmm,
got to be the hardest thing because like 25 years ago, it would have been a lot more rare. But like this, I feel so. I don't feel bad saying this actually because I'm not a therapist. I don't give a fuck. If
yeah,
I
you
was
can
a
say what you want.
therapist and I
I'll be
asked
careful.
somebody what was going on, and they actually gave me like 1 through 8, like the textbook diagnostic criteria for whatever fucking thing they think that, I don't think I would believe them. I'd be like, well, hold on, we're gonna have to talk about all these because I would feel like, are you just regurgitating to me like the entry in the DSM-5 so that like for whatever thing? Do you honestly have all these things, or have you just read the
Yeah.
article on it and now you can kind of identify? Because to be honest, for a
Hmm.
lot of things you can identify with them if you stretch it just a little bit, right? Like you,
Yeah.
yeah. Have you seen like the selling? We talked about this earlier. The selling of like testosterone replacement therapy. Every single guy in the world, like part of having low
Yeah.
testosterone. Some of the symptoms are like, do you have are you agitated sometimes? Are you sleepy a lot? Are you gaining weight? Like, yeah, this is like fucking 95% of men in America. Yeah, we all have low T, I guess, or you
Sure.
can do a lot of things for anxiety, for depression, for depending on how you stretch the conditions. Yeah, that seems like it would be really challenging from a therapeutic point of view. Yeah.
Sure. This will sound weird.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't. I should probably just be a little bit less careful with my language.
Okay.
I feel like your average person could take a 6-week course and diagnose accurately.
Mm-hmm.
Like, diagnosis is just about one of the easiest parts of the job.
Mm-hmm.
It is not difficult to read a book and go through. There's something called the skid. And I just, like, for disclaimer, I am sharing this as entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
I am not telling
Sure.
anybody
To
to
go
use this on
diagnose
family,
their friend.
friends, all
Yeah.
that stuff. Yeah, don't diagnose. There's something called the skid. It is literally a form of yeses and nos.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like a computer algorithm, but on paper, though there is a computer version. And if you say yes enough times and no enough times, it spits out a pretty accurate diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's diagnosing is not a very difficult thing to do. And I feel like, again, it kind of gets a lot of weight. Now, this is where the experience piece comes in that I think is really important. There are two recurring phrases in the DSM that is deviate significantly from social norms,
Yeah.
and uh, not better explained by.
Mm-hmm.
And if you follow those two things, like those are pretty helpful. So somebody could say something like, "Yes, I do these things, these things, these things," but real life lived experience when you're working with somebody, there are some things where it's like, "Wow, that was a really remarkable thing that you just did."
Mm-hmm.
Like, you screamed at a partner for 3 hours. That's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Or whatever it might be. So yeah, it would be very easy to say the right things. We can all do that.
Mm-hmm.
The diagnosis piece isn't the hardest part. The showing up to sessions every week is can be a bit harder than that.
Mm-hmm. Are you I don't know if you're allowed to share this or choose to or choose not to.
Sure.
When you're seeing a patient that presents with issues, do you
Mhm.
always share a diagnosis if you feel pretty confident about one, or is there some other thing that you appeal to internally to make the decision on whether or not you would share that with the patient?
It super depends on the person.
Uh-huh.
If it's relevant, I might. So there are a lot of people who will downplay their symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
and those people aren't really online. Oh, zinger. But
Okay.
there are a lot of people who will downplay symptoms.
Uh-huh.
And in those cases, it could be a helpful intervention to be like, hey, is it okay if we read something together? What do you think about that?
Okay.
And then you go through and you read it off. There are other people where I might not want them to know that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for because of concerns about like I'm not necessarily sure what you would do with this information.
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe I know something about their interpersonal relationships, I know something about their family, and my thought process is like, if I tell you this, this might be weaponized,
Sure.
and I would not want this information to be weaponized against a loved one.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people like that, which kind of makes me think about the talking point a little bit about like invoking your therapist in casual conversation.
Yeah.
Uh,
Which
just,
I
uh-huh.
don't talk enough, but that's incredibly bullshit to do. I don't know if I've ever actually publicly said that before because I try, especially because if I'm having conflict, I try not to give like big rules of thumb all the time because I feel like it's going to sound very personally tainted, and it might be sometimes I don't recognize
Mhm.
it. But in my opinion, invoking a therapist who is not there to mediate or arbitrate disagreements between you and other people, they're not there to do that. So invoking them in a conversation with another person is a pretty bullshit like appeal to authority, and in my
Yeah,
opinion could be a form, depending on the mental fortitude of the other person, could be a form of manipulation. If you're
sure.
invoking a professional to declare somebody else's behavior is incorrect, when that professional is never there to evaluate somebody else's behavior, is a really big bullshit thing to do. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, like personally, I super do not like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes up sometimes, and it can come up in interesting times. And I really like everybody they work with, and heaven forbid somehow this whatever, But it has been come up a few times where it's like, hey, I did that thing we talked about, and I told my wife I was going to leave her.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, wait, what? Excuse me? I don't remember that part of the discussion where we talked about leaving your wife. And so, you can be invoked in ways like that that can be pretty uncomfortable. And the conversation that I might have with somebody, and everybody can do it different, is like, what was important about bringing me up in that space?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was important about, using me as a reference in that conversation?
Mm-hmm.
And is there any way that, we could avoid that in the future? Because not super fair to me,
Mm-hmm.
boundaries.
Something that not to reference any particular person, but something that
Uh,
frustrates me sometimes is uh, when people will learn like a term, but they
mhm.
don't really understand the
Yeah.
like terms in psychology are pretty worthless if you just know like the term and
Yeah.
the 5 word explanation. You kind of need
Not
like
to cut
more.
you off, but like
Yeah.
gaslighting's the big one, I feel. That's
Sure.
that's the
Yes. Oh
one
my
that's
God. Yes.
the ultra mega. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody lying to you is not gaslighting you,
Hmm.
or somebody forgetting something, or somebody being mean to you isn't necessarily gaslighting you. Yeah, another big one. Oh my God, I get so
Hmm.
frustrated with this. Are you familiar with the term grooming?
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
So, and it not I don't approve anything, of course, but like an adult fucking a
Yeah.
minor, that's not grooming. Two people
Hmm.
like abusing power dynamics is not grooming. Like grooming my understanding at least of grooming implies a very specific deceitful relationship, oftentimes
Uh-huh.
between an adult and a minor, where you entertain a certain type of relationship with the goal of later exploiting that relationship to turn it sexual once you've gained the trust in like a non-sexual setting. That's my
Hmm.
understanding of what grooming is, and it refers to something like pretty particular and pretty horrible for a variety of reasons. You're destroying
Sure.
this person's ability to trust people in the future. But sometimes people will have a relationship. It's like, oh, 20-year-old guy fucked 16-year-old girl. He groomed her. Or like famous person fucked a fan. He groomed that person. It's like, damn, wait, hold on. What the fuck? That's not what this means at all. Oh, it's super, super, super
Yeah.
frustrating to see people throw around. Like gaslighting is another big one as well. Yeah.
Well, just to name it, groomers don't just groom victims; they
Mm-hmm.
also groom families of victims.
Sure. Yeah, they can. Yeah.
They
Because they'll be
they
family
put
friends.
themselves in a position where they are indispensable and all that stuff. And so, what can be helpful about knowing that is just like, oh, I rely on this person for a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How do I feel about that? Not that anybody who's helpful is that way. Yeah, no, those things can be misused a lot, and again, pure entertainment, not telling people how to do therapy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like that would be like where a narrative technique would come into play about like, what is important about this word gaslighting?
Yeah.
Like, why doesn't it get to just be like a lie? Like why isn't it just that this person was dishonest with you?
Mm-hmm.
And then saying that honestly, not rhetorically, but like tell me about that. Like what feels right about that word? And then you would have like a conversation and discussion about what feels right about that word.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah, another piece I wanted to share with you that I thought was interesting is, sort of not referencing anything here, but borderline personality in the
Yeah.
context of ethical entitlements.
Okay.
I think this is a very interesting idea. So like looking at personality disorders in general, I think they're very sexy because people kind of know what they are
Mm-hmm.
and like they can be really intense. And I would say the simple I like things easy. The way that I think about it is like this is like the filter through which you view the world
Mm-hmm.
all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you are like avoidant personality disorder, you view the world through the lens of everybody can see your faults and failures.
Sure. My
And they're all just
understanding, you correct me
yeah.
if I'm wrong, but I think that for
Hmm.
personality disorders, you're not typically aware of them, right? Because it's a personality, or
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Well, and that's tough. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's a thought experiment that I use with folks sometimes. We call it the depression shot
Mm-hmm.
thought experiment, which is this idea of like if I walk up to you and I give you a shot of depression,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that I have it, and you know that once I give it to you, you're going to have it for some length of time,
Mm-hmm.
does that matter that you watch me do that?
Gotcha.
And it's everybody's answers are remarkable, but a lot of folks will say like, no, it doesn't. Um, so is somebody aware? Is somebody not? They might be aware, but the emotional pain or the turbulence is so strong that it doesn't super matter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the context of something like BPD, and I don't know if anybody's listening who has BPD, this
Mm-hmm.
might be an interesting concept. Like, I want to try to speed run this because I don't know, maybe this will be interesting.
Sure.
So there's a model called contextual therapy, and this was a super cool thing I got to learn about in internship, and it kind of hits on this idea of like four components. There's like your history, which is really the history of your parents, what they did, how they acted, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That informs your psychology.
Okay.
And like your psychology is how you view the world, like your sense of ethics, your workout, all that fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a tendency to inform this idea of the ledger. And the ledger is sort of this idea of like everybody we meet, whether we're like aware of it or not, we keep a running tally of like, do we have a good interaction with this person or a bad interaction?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I needed money. This person gave me money. We had lunch together. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
He's a cool dude. I can trust this person. Versus like, no, he said no and that he doesn't lend people money, and that made me feel bad, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
And the idea behind an ethical entitlement is if I have a huge debt with somebody, if I feel like they've screwed me over enough,
Mm-hmm.
then I get to do bad things.
Okay.
Um,
Sounds
so
based. Yes, I agree
yeah,
with it. Hell yeah.
exactly. Like, you have been so mean to me that I can say whatever I want to you
True.
because I'm ethically entitled to do so. And what's interesting about this is like, let's say somebody steals, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You might be like, you're not allowed to steal. That's a bad thing. It's like the fact that I did says that I can. I am ethically entitled to. That fits with my system.
Okay.
So we can imagine that if somebody's struggling with something like borderline, where, you're watching a movie together and this person's talking and you say like, "Hey, would you mind keeping it down a little bit?"
Mm-hmm.
And how their brain filters that information is like you were screaming and embarrassing them in front of the whole room
Mm-hmm.
to keep their mouth shut. They might feel ethically entitled to be like, you know what, screw you, you're going to be an alcoholic just like your dad.
Sure.
And you're like, whoa, that was harsh. What?
Mm-hmm.
But it comes from a perspective of like the thing that you said was far more hurtful to them than the thing that they said to you.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way they could match the pain that you caused them.
Yeah.
Interesting idea.
Yeah, I understand.
Hmm.
Anything else?
Well, I was just thinking about like one of the memes I wrote down was the self-diagnosis meme.
Oh
I don't know if
God.
that was.
Yeah. We
You-
talked around that issue
yeah.
earlier, but my
Okay.
incorporating like two of the earlier things we said, the two problems I was at one, a diagnosis should give you some utility. So if you
Right.
self-diagnose and then you do nothing about it, why the fuck do you have this diagnosis? Fuck off. Just
Okay,
go do
perfect.
something. Yeah, that's the first
Damn,
thing.
you guys nailed it.
Yeah, and then the second thing was the kind of people don't really have a good understanding all the time of a lot of these personality or mental illnesses. And when you get more and more people running around, I think you are like legitimately destroying people's fundamental understanding of mental illness or even psychology in general.
God damn.
Yeah, it's like a really big one I think for me are like things like triggers, for instance.
Sure.
I feel like triggers are incredibly real, and especially if you have some form of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, like a trigger can like evoke a physiological response from nothing for no good reason. That's why it's a trigger. And I feel like that's a thing where like people have that word means nothing anymore. Like so many, I guess, words do. Where like people will be like, oh, if a guy walks up to me and he calls me the N-word, like that's a trigger. And it's like, that's not a trigger. That's a legitimately shitty, horrible thing. You should have a negative response to that. Like, what do you mean? Yeah, these aren't triggers.
Yeah.
These are just, yeah, you have negative response. Like triggers by definition, at least my understanding, a trigger is irrational. You have triggers and you shouldn't, right? These are things you want to get rid of. And that's just like one of like a million things where it feels like people like using all of these words all the time. Like they basically just mean nothing anymore. And that kind of frustrates me sometimes when they.
Well, and you're hitting on a huge boundary thing there that actually, I wrote down the meme of like, don't invite somebody to your house. And it made me so sad how much pushback you got around that one. Um, is that clear enough what I'm
Referring to?
Of like,
like, I had a conversation where basically,
Right.
Especially somebody who's bisexual and has experience with both sexes. At least for men, I would fuck somebody before I would invite them back to my house. It's like that is like probably one of the most intimate things is showing somebody where I live. The only thing I can think of that's more intimate than that is like showing somebody where my kid lives, which is another thing that for single people that are dating that have children or whatever, is something to consider as well. And that seemed to be a very, very controversial take. And there were so many people like, what if you just want to play video games? There's so much crazy stupid shit said.
And that just made me so sad because kind of like talking about what you were just there about like the trigger piece, like boundaries are hard. And with almost everybody that I work with, within like the first 5 to 10 sessions, we will generally have like a concrete discussion about boundaries. Because I like, it's just good to know like how people feel about boundaries. Can they set them? Blah, blah, blah. And one of the things with boundaries, a lot of people don't know what their boundaries are.
Sure.
Like if you ask them point blank, like, what are your boundaries? They might not be able to tell you. And so there is this process of like figuring out those boundaries. So for somebody who has a hard time even identifying what their boundaries are, telling that person like, go do what you want, which that's mean, that's not fair. But, essentially like, to misread a cue, like that person may need to learn boundaries. And an important boundary component is the boundary of safety, which would be defined as like you can protect yourself from exploitation and you can read signs that somebody is abusive or selfish.
Sure.
Not everybody knows how to do that. And that's actually something of yours that I stole and I use. And sorry you don't get royalties off this. But it was one of the things where you were sort of talking about like, I try to have my relationships in a way where it's like I can enjoy the good of somebody and parse out the bad. That's exactly what we want to go for. The way that I explain that to folks is like, if I'm like a level 1 RPG character, maybe I have no boundaries. I know nothing about them. And maybe at level 5, I'm like scorched earth. Like somebody screws with me, I cut them out of my life. They're done forever.
Sure.
But maybe at level 10, I can like enjoy the good and realize like, you know what? Doug is bad with money. I'm not going to let him borrow it. Or like this person does some things I don't like. I'm going to avoid the path of harm.
Yeah.
So, that's the very long way of bringing back to that idea of like, triggers of being like, figuring out your boundaries is an important thing to do. That may be a way of kind of like understanding what the boundary is. But man, really sad to, I don't know, put somebody in a situation where maybe they're questioning their boundaries or trying to figure it out, if that makes sense.
Here's always be aware that these conversations might haunt you in the future. I don't know, just always be.
Well, like I said,
so
try to not say anything I wouldn't want anybody to, cancel me over.
I'm going to start with something I know to be true, and then I'm going to extrapolate to something I worry about, okay?
Sure.
I have a feeling, I spent a lot of time around children growing up because my parents did daycare, and then I have a child, so I've seen my child grow.
Sure.
I feel like children, I noticed this thing when my mom was doing daycare, it felt like. When a child hurts themselves, it almost feels like the first thing they do is they look to the closest adult to see what the reaction should be. I almost get that feeling sometimes, yeah. And I noticed that my son's grandparents do this all the time. It drives me crazy. The kid runs into a table, and then like you look at him and you laugh, you pick him up or whatever. They might like whine for a second, but generally they're off running away doing whatever. Yeah. Kids do crazy shit. But if you have like, I hate to use the stereotype, but if you have like the mom or the grandma that the kid runs to the table and was like, oh my God. And then, they're running to the table, they pick him up and say, oh, I'm so sorry. Like the kid will cry over nothing. It'll be insane.
Sure.
Do you
talking about attachment styles?
Sure, it could be. Yeah, it could.
Transitioning into a little bit here. Yeah.
Okay, hot take. Okay, so
oh boy,
speak carefully, right? I speak about this thing now. I don't know if this is a term coined by Dr. Bunnell. Okay, maybe I made this up, or maybe this exists somewhere in the literature. Sometimes I get this feeling of
Uh-huh.
like reverse traumatization or like a
Mm,
retrospective traumatization where somebody goes through an event and actually first let me give the example that I know can happen, so I'm being responsible, okay?
sure.
I think it is totally possible that you could undergo some fucked up things as a child, not be aware of it, and it has a negative impact on your life, and then through later discussion or therapy you have talks, you realize, wow, I don't trust these types of people all the time because of these negative experiences. Now I can connect with that, now I can fix that, right? That totally, I'm
Yeah.
sure, happens, right? But sometimes
Uh-huh.
I get the feeling there are people that they have like a shitty experience and it's bad or whatever. But then through like later discourse or dialogue years later, they start to like reverse traumatize themselves where they invent like a far more negative emotional response to that initial situation that really doesn't need to be there. It doesn't serve anything. Do you understand what I'm talking? Do you feel like this is like this retroactive trauma? Is this a real thing or am I completely imagining this? Or yeah, what do you,
Well,
yeah.
I'd have a totally different take on it, and this will
Yeah.
probably be really unsatisfying.
Okay.
So, you know, part of the framework that I sort of work under is that like everything we do serves a purpose. Our goal is to figure it out. And I'll use the example of like eating glass. Like most people don't eat glass because
Mm-hmm.
there's absolutely nothing beneficial about it.
Mm-hmm.
It hurts, it will kill you. We just don't do it. But a maladaptive coping skill,
Mm-hmm.
like some way that I interface with the world that seems to be all bad, there is probably something helpful about it. And it would probably be worth our time to figure out what that helpful thing is.
Okay, true.
And I know in these communities, like in, you talk about this, and I'm not being mean. Steven's mean, but I'm not. I'm chill.
Okay.
They validate the hell out of each other,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's a space where you can kind of come on and discuss these things and get tons of validation. And it may be validation that was absolutely not present when it needed to be when they were younger.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be kind of my way that I would choose to view it, because, it's a pretty compassionate way to view it.
Mm-hmm.
You have no obligation to be compassionate if you don't want to be, though.
Mm-hmm.
So,
How?
yeah.
So here's something that I'm kind of curious about, and this would
Yeah.
be I could even personal advice on this. How do you figure out when you need to be compassionate and validating versus when you need to be challenging to to be effective in somebody else's life?
Yeah. Talking about those therapy words, gotta sound cool. Empathic confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
When we engage in the empathic confrontation. Um,
So to be clear, this is you're talking about being confrontational with somebody,
right.
but not just to shit on them, but because you're truly
Right.
trying to evoke a better response or a reaction or something out of it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And the way that I tend to open that up is like, hey, I'm gonna say something mean on purpose, and
Mm-hmm.
this is not something I believe. Okay? Are you ready? And then I will say the thing, and that'll be my way. Again, this is pure entertainment. I'm not teaching people how to be therapists and
Sure.
whatnot. Um, you know, when a belief doesn't mesh up with reality,
Mm-hmm.
that's when that might come out. And again, not to stroke your ego, but like that's one of the things that I like about your content is sort of this push towards like let's operate in reality. Like let's read an article and get on the same page with what's happening in the real world.
Sure.
When somebody brings something up where it's like, that just doesn't really mesh with reality,
Mm-hmm.
I might challenge them on that thing.
Yeah. Although I'll concede, or not concede, but I'll say that
Hmm.
unfortunately that conversation is far more difficult when mental health is the subject, right? It's easy to
Sure.
ascertain, was this conviction happening because of Russiagate versus does everybody actually hate you, right? One of these
Sure.
things is like we can point to the external world and know it. The other is people's assumptions of what is truly unknowable stuff, right? We can't reach anybody's mind. And those conversations get a
Yeah.
lot more difficult, yeah.
But that's where the job gets really fun because then it's like, okay, if everybody hated you, how would we know?
Mm-hmm.
Let's just practice and assume that that's true. Everybody hates you.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know this? What do we observe in the real world that tells us that? And those conversations are really generally pretty fruitful and enjoyable to have with people.
So here's something that
Mhm.
so here's a question that I have.
Yeah.
I did a lot of drugs in my 30s. I'm 32 now, okay? I'm doing lots of drugs,
Sure.
okay? Prior to doing a lot of drugs, I would have said that like my thoughts are like 85 to 90% cognitive, okay? That my rational brain is working, and maybe I have this underlying 5 to 15% like vibe or mood or whatever, right? I have like
Yeah.
this kind of shit, whatever. But it's not really that important because I'm a smart guy. I can think my way through pretty much anything. I'm good to go. Post drugs, I've completely flipped that. I feel like I have a very healthy, strong, and good mind, but I don't know how much credit I get for that because like 90% of that shit is running under the hood and I don't think about it or do anything, right? When I wake up, I have a high drive naturally to
Uh-huh.
do things. I'm excited to get out and achieve and talk to people and go to the gym. Like I have this excitement and I don't really do anything to get that. I don't like deserve it. I'm not like working hard. I just naturally have it.
Hmm.
Something that I noticed is that I never thought about until my drug experiences is it seems like you have like this cognitive way of understanding things, and then
Hmm.
you have like this emotional way of understanding things. And I didn't realize that these were two different things until I had very short like mental health bouts post
Yeah.
doing lots of mushrooms. And something that I realized was that I don't know how you bridge a cognitive understanding with an emotional understanding. So there were very very short periods of my life where I had something
Wait.
akin to
Well,
like,
really
yeah,
quick,
go.
let's make sure we're operating on the same definitions. What is your definition of cognitive right
Oh,
now?
sorry. Okay, maybe I'm using it properly. When I say
You,
cognitive, I just mean like a
Mhm.
mental process by which we think about things like consciously. So like,
Okay. Perfect.
yeah.
Yeah, we're operating on the same wavelength. I just wanted to make sure that we were.
Gotcha. Okay. So
Hmm.
I had like very small bouts of weird, something akin to maybe general anxiety disorders or major depressive disorder, where I could like read things and my brain still worked. I could understand stuff, but on an
Hmm.
emotional level, I was like in a different place, and I couldn't do anything to change that.
Yeah.
How do you, when you're communicating with somebody? Fuck, I feel like your answer is just going to be a lot of CBT or DBT. Yeah, when you deal with
Maybe.
somebody, it's one thing to have a conversation to say, like, does everybody hate you? It's one thing to know cognitively, yeah, everybody doesn't hate me, of course. But it's another thing to truly feel that on an emotional level. How do you bridge that or reinforce that emotionally, I guess?
I really want to be like a lot of CBT, DBT, but the idea behind that. So like this has popped up on stream before. I don't think this is not dense,
Okay.
but like the triangle, your thoughts, your emotion, your behaviors are all connected. They all impact one another. And what is helpful
This is
about viewing
you're
things
talking
like
about like the CBT model, right?
right,
Yeah.
yeah, but DBT builds on that. It takes from that and then adds a lot of acronym skills and also kind of hits on this idea of like the dialectic, the two opposite ideas can be true at the same time, or we can identify more than one truth at one time, which can be very frustrating for black and white thinkers.
Sure.
Um, but what is helpful about that is it's sort of like, if I don't know how I'm feeling, I can look at my behavior and I can be like, well, I'm not really sure how I'm feeling, but I'm kind of acting like a depressed person.
Okay.
I'm playing video games, I'm not leaving, I'm not doing all this stuff. If I don't know what I'm feeling, what am I thinking about? Well, I'm thinking about how much I want to die.
Okay.
Oh, well, that's something a depressed person might do. So it kind of gives us some insight into like our stuff, and then we could look at how do we want to change that. Because a big component of, when we get into therapy, shoot, first thing you do is informed consent. There are risks and benefits to treatment.
Hmm.
Risk of treatment, whatever you change in your life, you're probably going to feel worse before you feel better.
Sure.
Benefits, it can also be super helpful. So there is a good chunk of time that somebody might be using these skills and it doesn't feel very good.
Hmm.
And it really is about sort of acting different to the emotion for a long enough time that we start to sort of see like the benefits of a situation and then we can start to change the narrative. We can kind of just change our story a little bit
Hmm.
and ultimately things might not bother us as much.
Gotcha.
Not necessarily a miracle worker. Like what we talk about may not stop like a panic attack.
Hmm.
Like, it's a biological response that hits you fast, but I think it can be really helpful, obviously, in the long run. Otherwise, probably would do it.
Gotcha. So
Yeah,
no, yeah, okay. Um, here's a random question.
sure.
Um, this is a hard one. I don't know if there's a good answer to this. How do you determine why does it seem like there are some people that
Mhm.
have very high levels of resiliency and others that don't, even when at least superficially, like the circumstances seem relatively similar? Yeah.
Yeah,
Is there like
dude.
a big like the research says there's like this huge thing? Yeah, I'm curious because that's like a
So,
yeah.
so first off, I love talking about this stuff, which is part of the reason I reach out because I really enjoy talking about this stuff.
Hmm.
So at no point will I get sick of these questions. But two, as far as I can gather, that is a bit of a mystery.
Hmm.
And I didn't come with, facts and logic. I didn't come with stats or whatever. But I feel like at some point in school, we sort of read this idea that it's sort of like a 25-50-25 deal, where it's like 25% of people who experience a traumatic situation
Hmm.
might go on to develop PTSD. 50% might be totally fine. And another 25% might have like a euphoria experience
Mm-hmm.
where it's like that sort of like, like, wow, I had a heart attack and I got really healthy. I turned my life around. I'm a completely different person than I was.
Mm-hmm.
And your chat is incredible about digging stuff up. So I'm sure somebody can probably find that next 5 to 10 minutes. But there is a real mystery to like we don't necessarily know.
Mm-hmm.
There's obvious things like repeated exposure for sure. The more traumatic things you experience, the more intense it is. The
Oh, so like stuff
helplessness,
related to
yeah,
is it like ACEs, I think they're called, where if you have
right.
like
Adverse
yeah.
childhood experiences,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, ACEs could do it. Repeated exposure to trauma. So if somebody's in like an abusive parent situation, physical, emotional, sexual, that's certainly like the repeated piece.
Mm-hmm.
The situation in Canada seems to be brought up a lot. That's kind of the famous one where I want to say like the 80s or 90s, there's like a 100 car pileup or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of utilized as a way to get data on like who developed this and who didn't.
Yeah.
Um,
This is a frustrating one because, and I was
yeah.
so guilty of this in my early 20s.
Hmm.
For whatever reason, I consider myself to be a very, very, very resilient person. And people that are resilient, that become public figures, often tend to like prescribe trauma to people
Yeah.
as a way of strengthening themselves. And it took me a long time to realize,
Yeah.
hold
No
on,
way.
yeah, this is such a stupid fucking thing to say. The most egregious way that I would do this is and I
Hmm.
still to this day I have to intellectualize this because I can't feel it at all. I cannot understand on an emotional level people that are held hostage or have problems with family members. And for the longest time, I'd be like,
You're right.
yeah, if your mom's an asshole, fucking cut that bitch out. You never talk to her again, right? Maybe show up at the funeral, maybe not. Fuck it, right? And I would give advice like this all the time. It's like, okay, wait, hold on. Not everybody necessarily like responds to situations the same way. It's really stupid and foolish to assume that. Or like I would say like for online stuff, like, oh yeah, like I like just throwing myself into like crowds of people that boo at me and hate me and say mad nasty things. I think that builds a
Yeah.
lot of character. I think it's really, you should try it too. And a lot of people have like almost traumatic, I would say traumatic responses to this in streaming communities to like receiving the level of hate. It's a really hard thing for people to learn, that like it's not. And you see it pop up everywhere, like, oh, we need to beat our
Right.
kids again. That made real men. Or, back when
Oh
men
God.
were men and they
Yeah.
were 18 years old in World War II. It's like, damn, is that really where we need to go? Like, is that the way to do it? Yeah.
Well, and the reality, and I'm not knocking you. I'm sure you've done great things. Like
Hmm.
the biggest thing you have done to be resilient in that way may be absolutely nothing that was into your control. Like
Completely.
it's just your
Yeah.
brain, like just the way you're wired.
Hmm.
Like it just doesn't bother me. There's a really interesting documentary. I want to say it was on a Myanmar general who like killed a ton of people,
Hmm.
and it's a bizarre film, but they make like a Bollywood-esque style recreation of the events,
Hmm.
and ultimately he comes to terms with the spoiler. Sorry, people.
Okay.
Well, I don't
I
know.
don't think I have a lot of
Okay,
frequent Bollywood viewers in chat, so you're probably safe on this one. Go ahead.
but
Oh,
what
people
you
are saying
have
the
is
name of
this
the movie is The Act of Killing.
perfect,
Okay.
yeah, and the one dude like has this complete visceral meltdown response when he realizes what he did, and there's another dude who did similar things who's just like had no problem going to bed at night, just like that. The past is the past, present's the present. I don't think about this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but damn it, you were talking about
Resiliency. Some
African
people are. You
resiliency.
correctly brought up that a lot of people will take credit for their resiliency when the reality is
Yeah,
maybe when they were 2 years old, maybe they saw some shit they don't even realize is what made them. Yeah. But go ahead.
or they just don't feel it. Like they just
Hmm.
don't have that bone in there. God damn it, I don't remember what I was gonna say. Shit, that's okay.
Wait,
It's probably
let's
gonna be
think about
life
it. You were
changing.
bringing up Myanmar general. They interviewed him about all the killing.
Yeah, they're talking about how one person felt it, the other person didn't. The resiliency. Oh, yeah, that's what I
Mhm.
was gonna say. Jeez Louise, sort of talking about this idea of emotional pain and trauma. Right. Yeah, that's a real dangerous one in terms of like one of the things that a conversation I'd have with folks is sort of like just like with physical exercise, like there is a good emotional pain and a bad emotional pain.
Mhm.
And like there's the emotional pain that's like going to the gym where your body hurts and you're sore, but it's making you stronger.
Mhm.
And then there's the emotional pain where you're like a day laborer, where your body's breaking down, your back's breaking down, your knees are going out.
Mhm.
Um, so like, breaking up with somebody that is not a good relationship might be a good, healthy emotional pain.
Sure.
The pain of like if you're not in an open relationship, being cheated on
Mm-hmm.
might be a very significant pain for somebody, and that's not a particularly healthy pain to experience.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, just go out and be cheated on so you can get used to it. Like, we wouldn't encourage that because that will generally change the way people view relationships. They can get really unhealthy beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
That's where things like, I need to check my partner's phone comes from,
Mm-hmm.
because one person screwed you over, so now you're acting like everybody's going to.
Sure.
It's not very healthy emotional pain. So kind of like recognizing that there are some things where it's like, yeah, I don't traumatize yourself because you think it's going to build character.
Yeah, but something like the loss of your first pet or whatever, these can be like
That's
incredibly,
valuable.
yeah, valuable developmental
Yeah,
experiences, yeah, or grandparents dying and stuff like that, yeah.
right. And then of course, you're kind of alluding to what we talked about a little bit, like the response of others around you is also very significant in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is kind of what can make it incredibly frustrating, when you're working in a situation where adults are not necessarily following through with their adult duties,
Yeah.
acting like an adult.
You mentioned doing like especially like drug and alcohol stuff for younger
Yeah.
people. It seems like it, the biggest sympathy that I have for, I would say, educators in general, but then even
Yeah.
more specifically people that like do stuff that like what you do, is that so much of what you do is outside of your control, and
Oh
more
yeah.
frustratingly outside of your patient's control as well sometimes,
Oh yeah.
especially if it's a child. At least if they're like 20 or 30, you can say like, you need to change your environment, find better friends, separate something. But man, if it's a child and they have just a shitty home life, you're really asking the impossible, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, they
Yeah.
don't even have a frame of reference for what a healthy life at home looks like. How could you possibly tell them what to change, or how could they understand what they need to change? Like, that's got to be an incredibly sad and frustrating experience to deal
Yeah.
with. Mm-hmm.
And it's tough because nobody that I work with, but there is a sort of a special kind of parent
Mm-hmm.
that you will encounter sometimes where it's like, ah, we're screwed here.
Yeah.
Uh, we're nothing we do is really going to work because you can offer family counseling and the person can refuse.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that dynamic of like, I'm not the one with the problem, they're the one with the problem, fix my kid.
Yeah.
And it's that's hard, that's super hard. And actually the ASAM criteria, which is like the drug and alcohol, like what level of care should somebody be in, level 6 is recovery environment, and hits on exactly that. Like, you could be doing real well in all the other 5 dimensions, but if where we're sending you is a place where you have free access to use drugs or you have whatever, like,
Mm-hmm.
that matters. Makes it real tough.
Yeah. I think
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah. Something
Yeah.
something that I say I try to do this, but I don't I don't really have many friends left anymore. But like if you know that like a friend has like certain mental health issues or whatever, it feels like learning from that friend's therapy, like techniques or whatever, to reinforce what they're learning, or to reinforce what they're doing. That kind of stuff is like exponentially more helpful than just that person working on it solo or something. Because the environmental factors are so important in determining the successful outcome of any like psychologically therapeutic technique or whatever.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I can find a little bit cringy sometimes about like when folks are posting on like, mental health positive, like here's how to be a positive ally,
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. Not knocking anybody who does that too much. But it's like the simplest things are often that, like, hey, what kinds of things are you learning about that are really helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you need from me as your friend? Like those types of things are ultimately way more effective in somebody's treatment and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I
Mhm.
really like is kind of like general rules of thumb. Is you can always correct me if I'm wrong, by the way.
Sure.
I believe that in the DSM, when we talk about like addiction, there is a lot of shared criteria, I believe, for assessing whether or not somebody has an addiction. And I think a lot of these things are
Well, it's
good.
the same for every drug. It's just the name of the drug changes, but
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
same 11 criteria.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Oh, I didn't know it was the exact same. So yeah, it's even better, right?
Yeah.
And I think that
Hmm.
these are good things to look at for every type of behavior. We don't need to talk
Yeah.
about drugs, yeah. So like some of the shared ones are like, does this basically it all is like, is it impeding your ability to live a normal life? Are you compromising relationships? Are you unable to hold down a job? Are you not able to take care
Boom.
of your body, like being clean? Are you
Yeah.
missing important engagements to have have these types of experiences or whatever. I think
Do
that
you have a medical condition that it would make worse, but you
yeah,
choose to do it anyway?
yeah,
That's
yeah,
a big
yeah.
one.
And I feel like having an understanding of things, because a lot of people got really ass mad when, I don't know, it might have been the WHO declared like gaming addiction was a real thing. And I remember that like I read their whatever criteria they listed, and I was like, yeah, this is the criteria for any addiction, like gambling addiction,
Yeah,
like all of it looks the exact same. And you should be aware of these things. If gaming is something that like you're skipping work to
right.
game, you're not able to hold down a job, you don't have friends anymore, you're not taking showers, it's ruining your life, you can't maintain healthy relationships, like, yeah, this is absolutely an addiction that you should be aware of. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's and this is what we kind of got the rundown in grad school is that it just barely missed the DSM-5,
Mm-hmm.
so it will almost certainly be in the DSM-6 whenever that comes out. But DSM-5 they just didn't have enough information to feel good about being like it's a diagnosable thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there is
Oh,
more data out there now, so probably will be. Yeah.
okay. Now, okay, this might not be directly in your wheelhouse. Okay,
Okay. Oh boy.
what do you feel about DID?
Oh, man, that's a so oof.
Or let me, I maybe ask more specifically. Do you believe that dissociative amnesia is a real thing? Do you think that this is an actual thing that people experience?
Uh, this is a
Hard one.
yeah. I don't want to make anybody feel bad. Like
Okay, never mind. All right, gotcha.
yeah. I would say like dissociation. I think for sure is real.
For
And,
sure.
and I dissociation is a very common thing.
Mm-hmm.
A model that I use called internal family systems deals with this idea that like we have a family living with inside of us. We need to learn how to talk to the different parts,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds a little bit wild, but it's essentially like Inside Out the movie, but like inside of ourselves. So like
Okay.
describe the anxious part of yourself. What does he look like? What kind of clothes does he wear? How old is he? How does he feel or think about things? And it sort of like gives you an opportunity to view yourself in a different way so that you can like
Oh,
talk to all
interesting.
that stuff. Super cool model. I would love to learn more. It's like
Mm-hmm.
$1,500 to
Oh,
do
jeez.
like a one set like one I don't know training module,
Mm-hmm.
and there's three of them.
I doubt it borrows from it all, but it almost sounds a little bit
Hmm.
like. Have you ever heard of something called transactional analysis?
No, I don't think so.
Oh god, this is so long ago. But it's like the idea that anytime you have an interaction with somebody, you're either having like a parent, adult, or child interaction, and the goal is to always have adult interactions and not like parent child interactions or child
Oh,
adult or child
cool.
or something. It sounds
Yeah,
similar to that, yeah. But
that sounds kind of old school. That's neat though.
yeah,
I like
very
that.
old school. So probably total bullshit, but it reminded me of
Well,
that. Yeah.
yeah, we gotta be careful with that because the old school, like one of my pet peeves is when people like, take a dump on Freud. Because it's like, yeah, his stuff is dated, but man, you can read some of the transcripts of his sessions that he's done,
Hmm.
and some of them are brilliant. They're just like, holy cow, like this is a cool session to do.
Wait, what do
But
we mean by brilliant? Let's be careful there when we talk about Freud. Like,
like the intervention that he uses and the
mhm.
way that he talks to the person and sort of like the micro skills of like validation and stuff like that.
Okay, okay. So he
Good
was
use
maybe
of those
unintentionally
skills.
hitting on things that later on would be like validated as like therapeutically important or
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah, sure.
right. Yeah,
Okay.
but when we don't know much, we're like, oh, it's all about penises and poop and
Hmm.
wanting to do your mom, and it kind of gets like reduced a lot. And it's I just find that to be a little bit sad because it's like some of this stuff is neat.
Sure.
Like there's stuff that we can sort of glean from it.
I think that
I,
the most
I'm
important
not a psychoanalysis person.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The most important takeaway that I had from Freud was that Freud is somebody that is invaluable because he was the first person to treat psychology like an actual discipline in science.
Yeah.
Start writing stuff down and and that was like the most important contribution. And then there's other stuff, but it can get a little bit a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
We're talking about the frigidity of women or
Yeah.
the seven
Yeah.
stages of psychosexual development or whatever that don't really
Yeah.
have
Probably
like
don't
a
do that.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so we got on that. So DID. So I don't know. I would say that I have known a lot of folks
yeah. Hmm.
who question the validity of it.
Gotcha.
Um, and there are folks who are going to say this is absolutely real for me. How dare you invalidate my identity?
Hmm.
Um, I'm going to be a coward and say like, there's a lot of folks who sort of question it a little bit.
Gotcha.
Because there's sort of this idea. Have you heard of like integration?
I know the
Um,
word means. Maybe what you gotta
well,
explain.
so the idea of integration in the context of DID was sort of this idea about if you have DID, we need to work towards integration. So we need for all the parts to come together
Mm-hmm.
and become like one solid identified you.
Okay.
Um,
Gotcha.
and that's interesting. Um, yeah,
No underlying biomechanical explanations, no good
yeah.
models, no good clinical data, no good
Well,
reading.
you were watching the video on the woman who did the sex cult
The
thing.
satanic sex shit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sort of like, man, I must have read this in like 2007 or something like this, but I read
Mm-hmm.
an article about at that chunk of because I was still in college, so it must have been around 2007-ish,
Mm-hmm.
that it was like, psych degrees were the most fake degrees in the country.
Okay. Is this like an opinion or a fact, or what do you mean when you say that?
No, it's like I want to say I read it in like Time
Okay.
or something like that. That was like, at that time, like it was like a very so there can be enough mystique around it, and there can be enough like I don't necessarily know what you're doing. Like you can get away with some alarming stuff.
Sure.
And I would say anymore nowadays you can't really. Like if you say some type of remarkable claim, somebody's going to want to do a study on it. Somebody's going to want to check your numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's good. We obviously want to have like a very valid field.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, some of that stuff is sort of like there's no way to check it, as well as the fact if I want to say like it were DID to be a thing, the occurrence rate is like in the fractions of a percentile.
Sure.
Like you will probably never work with that person, which is again, it's not meant to invalidate it. It's just like it would be an incredibly rare phenomena.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Is there anything else?
I think I
Oh,
hit
I was
all the
gonna. I
main.
guess on that thing. I guess this is like
Hmm.
another thing where a complaint about like I feel like as a psychologist you would know this.
Hmm.
Um, the aspect of like if I ever ask, do you know a term? Really what I'm asking you is like, do I have a good understanding? I'm not trying to condescend. It sounds so stupid. But like,
Yeah,
if
no.
I say like priming, my
I was
understanding.
actually going to give you some cheat codes for arguing with psych students if you ever want to do that. One
Yeah,
of
sure,
the
always.
cheat codes is like ask them what their therapeutic model is and see if they can explain it to you like coherently in 4 to 5 sentences.
Gotcha.
Uh, that might sound mean, but if anybody's like listening, I like the spicy content. I
Mm-hmm.
like the argument sometimes. I'm old enough to know that I enjoy a little bit of drama. So
Sure.
yeah. Anyway,
Oh yeah, the satanic sex cult, that stuff where like I would
mhm.
be I would be so afraid as a psychologist. Like I feel like stuff related to priming, even as
Yeah.
a streamer, that's something that's like always in my mind. Where I know that just the way that I phrase a question is
Hmm.
absolutely going to change dramatically like the response that will be elicited. And there are so many
Yeah.
cute little studies and in class experiments and shit that teachers have done that have been like researched, Zimbardo's published about, blah blah, all these people, right? Where it's like, yeah, like, oh my god, like the way that
Yeah.
you can prime a question so minutely can like dramatically vary the results. Yeah, that satanic sex cult stuff was like, how can you not stop and think for a moment, like, man, am I hardcore priming the fuck out of this person to give me certain answers? Feels like something that you should just be aware
And
of.
you I would well, I get to make myself look great. Like I would say you do, and I would say most of the folks that I know do, and you do think about that a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'll even bring it up a little bit in a session where I might say something like, "Okay, so I'm kind of tainting the narrative here, like I'm injecting an idea or an opinion that didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want that to be known that that might change what we're going to do here."
Sure.
Um, because I don't know what people think about counseling or therapy, but it's not advice giving.
Mm-hmm.
You don't give people advice. You don't tell people what to do. Well, some people do, but you really ought not. And so it really is about kind of like understanding how somebody thinks and feels and how somebody does their stuff. Like that's the goal,
Mm-hmm.
is to understand like how you came to your thoughts and what it might take to change them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you really do have to be conscious of things like priming. You have to be conscious of the power dynamic. Your implicit biases are huge.
Mm-hmm.
Like, am I going easy on this person because I like them? So
Yeah.
I'm just not going to ask them tough questions, or is this person kind of lower on the socioeconomic status? So I don't really care if I show up like a couple minutes late to sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those are things you got to think about.
Sure. Okay, here's something. Might be a hot take for mine. Maybe we find disagreement here. Okay.
Oh boy.
I don't know if you heard this one. So, my view personally of therapy is that
Huh?
like therapy is it's essentially like a collection of tools that a person can acquire if needed to kind of like aid them through problems in life. So if you
Hmm.
have issues that come up and they're just confounding you constantly and you don't know how to overcome them, therapy is a chance by which you gain tools to gain control over yourself and your life.
Okay.
So something that I don't know if I want to say I'm critical of this, but like when I see somebody that is in when I see that like people who are doing therapy for like 10 or 20 years, that feels to me
Mm-hmm.
like I don't want to say there's a failure there, like the person has failed, because legitimately there might be like people that do need that level of help. But do you think that the goal of people in therapy should be eventually to not be in therapy anymore, or
Oh,
should it be?
absolutely.
Okay.
Everybody, that's like day one,
Mm-hmm.
like day one grad school. Your goal is to work yourself out of a job.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so, but God, that's a tough one. It's
Mm-hmm.
tough because you connect with people and you meet with them, and they're doing really great, and it's hard to have that conversation about like, so what are you thinking?
Yeah.
Few more weeks, or what do you want to do?
How do
You know,
you or yeah, go ahead.
because people meet their treatment goals. You know, people are like consistently meeting treatment goals. Life is going good,
Mm-hmm.
and you do kind of have to tone it down when that happens.
When it comes to things like medication, or
Mhm.
even yeah, therapy in general, like is it ever your place to suggest like maybe it's time we stop this, or what is like an appropriate level of like discomfort? Because anybody that's leaving medication or even therapy
Yeah.
probably is going to have to endure some level of discomfort to do it. Is it ever, do you ever feel like it's your job to push them in that direction, or do you just allow them to do as they do? Or yeah, that seems like a really difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an easy one. You know, you're real chill about it. And uh, going back to sort of the idea about like you know, the psych students and mistakes that might be made.
Hmm.
Like there's the APA code of ethics that ideally, you know, while you might not have them memorized, you would kind of know what they're all about.
Sure.
And it's things like, you know, supporting autonomy, non-malfeasance, fidelity, all that stuff. There's two others that I can't remember right now because I don't have
Okay.
them memorized. But you know, I just throw it out as like, hey, what do you think about medications? If you want, I can make a referral to the psychiatrist. If you're anti-medication, totally fine.
Hmm.
We don't have to explore that. What do you want to do? And then they kind of guide it from there. And then once they're on medications, I'm not a psychiatrist, but you know, we would do like monitor like how you feeling? How does the dose feel?
Hmm.
You know, what are things you would want the psychiatrist to know? Because they will see that person less frequently than they'll see me.
Sure.
Meds are a deeply personal one. You
Hmm.
know, some people view it as cheating. I think that's very sad.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. One of your takes it's not bad, but it's a little interesting. Is sort of talking about like, you know, when you kind of go on about like rates of medications are going up as a sign that maybe we're a little bit less happy.
Hmm.
Um,
Well,
and
yeah.
and you may be right there, but what I would say is like, how do we know that that's bad? And
It's
I don't
bad
want
that
to.
way. It's bad that we're less happy, or
How do we know that if an increase in medication necessarily conflates to less happy? And
oh,
of course,
sure, because
there's
the level one response is going to be like, well, maybe it's that there were a ton of people that were unhappy, but now we're just discovering it, right?
right,
Sure.
yeah, and there's like different ways. I mean, it's been studied. This is like that would be real easy to look up, but
Hmm.
and also I realize that makes me sound like I'm like throwing pills down people's throats, which
Hmm.
I it's a personal decision. If folks want to take meds, I say go for it, and if you don't, like don't do it.
Hmm.
It doesn't mesh with your stuff. Um, yeah, but that's a pretty easy one.
Wait, so for the medication part, how
Uh,
if somebody is on medication and it appears to be
uh
helping them, and then their life is in an area where they appear to be relatively stable, do you just open that conversation and you're like, hey, maybe it's time we lower the dose? Like, because it just seems weird because it's like you've got a person, and I guess I would almost view it as like I want
Oh,
to be
this
very
is the
clear.
easy part.
Oh yeah, okay, go.
I
Yeah, answer go.
I don't.
Oh, this is
That's a
just
conversation between them and the psychiatrist. That is not my job.
okay, gotcha. Oh well, that's cheating. You
Yeah,
cheated your way to that conversation.
I have
Okay,
cheated my way out of that, but that is not my place.
gotcha.
Um, which, you know, saying that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I do think that that's kind of an important thing for folks to know
Hmm.
is like what is the wheelhouse of a counselor and what is not.
Hmm.
Because
Sure.
sometimes people kind of do dip their fingers into things where it's like, I understand that you want to be helpful, but that is not really your place to do that.
Hmm.
Or you're kind of going, you know, outside of your role right now, and
Sure.
that's maybe not the best
Although
thing to do.
I think I'll push you or ask you on that.
Yeah.
A psychiatrist's job is to prescribe drugs. However, like a therapist and a psychiatrist generally work pretty closely as a team, right? To monitor like the response and everything, right? So you are going to
Yeah.
have a lot of input there in terms of should this person be on a particular drug or not. I would imagine, right?
Yeah,
Or
well, for sure. Like the psychiatrist, like that conversation will be mostly around like, do you think this person's drug seeking?
oh, so you're
Or
just
do you,
looking for contraindications, basically. You don't actually.
yeah, like, do you have any reason to believe that they should not have this medication?
Gotcha.
And most of the time, the answer is like no.
Hmm.
Like it's not coming up or whatever. Sometimes it'll be like, yeah, this person's been addicted to benzodiazepines in the past, and
Hmm.
I would be a little bit worried if you were to prescribe them a benzo. But there's a lot of options for medications.
Hmm.
So yeah, I was chuckling a little bit because it's sort of like it's not like, well, psychiatrists are probably doing well, but it's not like we're making like big money
Sure.
referring back and forth between us.
Hmm. Here,
Uh,
here's a
uh-huh.
question related to drugs, I guess.
Yeah.
What do you do when you have somebody that is incredibly, like, very suicidal, but whoa,
Mm.
Jesus Christ, sorry,
What?
you just fucking abuse me, okay? You're being abusive, okay? You're being abusive.
Oof.
What do
Cold
you?
and callous.
Yeah.
Ouch.
What do you do when you have somebody that is suicidal, but they've had a family member that's had like an adverse reaction to an SSRI? I say adverse reaction, but somebody, I'm thinking of Byron as an example, Reckful the streamer.
Okay.
So he had a brother that had, I think he was on SSRIs and he committed suicide. So obviously you know this. I'm repeating for the audience, right? But sometimes when a
Yeah.
person starts an SSRI, it can actually make them more suicidal, right? This is a possibility.
Yeah.
When you have somebody that has a family indication like that or a family contraindication like that, but they still seem suicidal anyway, if you can't pursue drug therapy, at any point, do you ever say like, fuck it, we'll try it anyway? Or is it like strictly off the table? Or this is a very like specific like diagnostic thing or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. I'm just curious what your
Well,
general thoughts are. I'm not asking you to like say,
sure.
to be really clear, you're not telling people like, oh, even if you've had this, do this, or whatever. Just as a general
No,
question.
I'm going to give my coward's answer. Like, that's a conversation between them and the psychiatrist.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I will also answer your question as because hot damn, that is a tough one.
Yeah.
I actually, had an experience in my family of a family member who had that experience. Like, they took a medication, they were very suicidal, and they completed the event. And it's just sort of like, God, you would, when you love somebody, you would hope that they would know, like, okay, one of the side effects is you're going to feel suicidal.
Hmm.
All right, you're feeling suicidal. Please put two and two together.
Hmm.
But it's tough. It's more complicated than that. And ultimately, you got to respect the person's autonomy to the best of the ability. I think one of the things that was kind of interesting. I don't want to move too far off,
Hmm.
but just hearing like the story about like the psychiatric hospitalization. Man, I know that people have some bad stories. Like,
Hmm.
God, that is just not my experience at all with that kind of stuff. Like, I much more often meet people who were not in a psychiatric hospitalization as long as they felt like they needed to be, as opposed to them being held longer than they thought against their will.
Are you talking about
Like,
people that have been like, is it Brady acted or whatever?
well, here we call it the Johnson unit, but the
Okay.
ED, emergency department, like
People that have
suicide.
been committed against their will,
Yeah,
basically, after a crazy, yeah.
right. Which is pretty weird. But most of the time, people they try to get out of here. Like,
Hmm.
we need to free up the space. It's rare that I hear about folks who are kind of held longer than they wanted to be.
Gotcha. Do you
Um,
think that might be reflective of that you're in a relatively better off, it seems like, economic community? Or do you think that's like the general experience across the country that most people appreciate that committed
it's
thing
got
more?
to be different
Hmm.
cross country. I must believe that because I know that it's been brought up before. Like the United States, there's like a bunch of different countries inside of a country,
Yeah.
and like one state's view of something could be like totally different than another.
Hmm.
And getting state parity for like standards is remarkably difficult. It's
Yeah.
hard to do. And there's a lot of stuff about like not wanting to do that. So
Hmm.
yeah, I totally believe that a different states or counties MO could be like, no, we hold the people. And mine is just sort of like, no, get them out of here.
Gotcha.
They're not suicidal now, so away with you. And it's kind of sad.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
I think the last thing I just wanted to sort of comment on was sort of the idea about like the good diagnosis versus the bad. So like one of the things that like dings me a little bit is hearing the term like clinical depression.
okay.
Because I think I mean, we all kind of get what somebody is talking about when they say that. And this might just be my own stuff
Mm-hmm.
that, I need to think through. The way that I tend to hear that is like there's the good depression and the bad depression.
Okay.
And it's like you've got clinical depression, so you've got the real one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just find that to be very frustrating because it kind of turns like mental health into like a pissing contest a little bit.
Yeah, I feel that way. Yeah. I think that there is a great utility in understanding the difference between those two things. But yeah, again, because of the borrowed language, like,
Yeah,
oh, wow, I just have normal depression like a shitter. Like, what right do I
yeah,
have to be
exactly.
upset or not? Yeah, I understand.
I got loser depression.
Yeah, it
Oh
made it
my.
might have sounded like a kind of a meme earlier, but I truly do feel like one of the most damaging aspects of mental health is the shared vocabulary. I feel
Yeah,
like that does an unbelievable amount of damage towards people's understanding of mental health issues because so many of these words are borrowed from normal language and like oh, OCD, like, well, OCD actually, I guess, isn't borrowed. People just co-opted it from psych and like, oh yeah, I have
sure.
OCD. I always clean my
Which
room
is
every
so
day.
sad because hot damn is that a cruel condition? Like that is an awful thing to live with for
Yeah, for
anybody
sure.
who like
Depending.
truly lives with it. It is terrible.
Um,
Ugh.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, or somebody that has like bipolar disorder, or
right.
here's I guess here's the thing. We kind of had like a roundabout, almost maybe a conversation about it earlier, but in a more serious conversation,
Hmm.
um, people with borderline,
Yeah.
um, do they? So I've heard this repeated a lot. I believe it based on my personal experience. Do people with borderline face a great deal of pushback in clinical settings, or I should say pushback, but like I'll be more blunt. Like people are scared to take on like borderline patients because they can be so difficult to deal with, and they just end up not doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is? Yeah, I'm curious what your experience is with
There's
that.
a real interest. I think we're on a good track with that societally. Man, that was like the belief for
Mm-hmm.
a chunk of time. That like I would say, because I came up in like 2009,
Mm-hmm.
and just in like that 12 years, a lot changed. But I'm working with people who've been doing stuff since the 90s, up through 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like apparently it sounds bizarre, but there was sort of this idea about like you cannot treat a borderline person, you don't want to work with borderlines. I would hear stories about like clinics like refusing borderline people,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just very strange. And that's kind of like the backstory of DBT a little bit was, I believe, that Marsha Linehan, the lady who invented the model,
I think it was
was a
actually
person,
for like borderline was
yeah,
one of the main
for
things.
borderline.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes a lot of sense because, the big component is like, how do you act differently than you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Which would be an incredibly important thing for somebody with borderline to work on. Um, so yeah, that stigma is there, like for sure. Like the behavior set can be very challenging for sure. Like I've worked with a couple of folks who have struggled with it, and those folks, they might call you out in session, which is cool. I like that stuff. Um, it's tough because it's sort of like, it's a lot of stories about like blowing up on other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard because it's like, you're really working on that. I know you're doing good stuff. Sad to hear that there's another explosive thing or,
How?
whatever.
Okay,
Hmm.
here's a very difficult question. Okay.
Hmm.
Maybe even not even an appropriate question actually. If you feel like you know somebody
Yeah.
and you feel like this person maybe has a cluster B personality disorder, how the fuck do you even begin to approach that conversation? Is it possible? Is there a responsible way to do it? Can you ever? Or like, I'm super curious. Yeah, what is your feeling on that?
uh, my answer is going to be really unsatisfactory.
Oh boy.
This is my job. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
That is none of my business. That is like if it was somebody that I was really close to,
Mm-hmm.
I might sort of push them towards counseling. Just
Mm-hmm.
be like, hey, counseling can be super helpful, all that stuff. But I think that part of the issue, especially when you get into the online stuff,
Mm-hmm.
is it's drama. It's juicy, it's fun, it's interesting, all that stuff. And there is a component, of, me drinking a glass of water and playing Factorio and listening to stuff on
Oh,
the
sure. To be
shift tab that's like, why do other people care so much about another person's diagnosis? Yeah.
Yeah, to be a little bit more clear, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily mean like
Oh,
in kind of an online meme sense. I mean, like, let's say that you have a close friend and you feel like, bro, you are fucking borderline or you are bipolar.
Oh
Yeah,
my
you have
gosh, I totally misheard that.
yeah.
My
I'm sorry.
bad.
I don't mean like the meme that. I mean
Whoops.
like you have a real life friend and you're like, and it's more than just like you need to fix your. It's like you need to get help. How do you broach that conversation? Is that even possible? Yeah.
Oh, geez. Oh, that's embarrassing.
Sorry. No,
Whoops.
you're fine.
So
You're fine.
totally different answer now. Um, Firm boundaries. Very firm boundaries about like you need help. A lot of validation because a key theme about somebody who struggles with borderline is going to be that fear of abandonment. And there are folks who struggle with borderline, and there's some documentations of some conversations, and you can kind of like predict when it's going to swell a little bit. Like, oh, yep, we got a little bit of abandonment coming in. This person's going to amp up, and then they do. And again, this is not to belittle anybody who struggles with borderline. I think learning like your patterns, what makes you tick, can be super helpful. Um, but then very firm boundaries with that person about like, these are the things that I can do and these are the things that I can't do. And that's really tough because folks, a person who struggles with borderline might seriously push those boundaries. And I think that that can be the hard thing for that person in your life is there can be a behavioral component, again, not trash talking anybody with borderline, where that person will like follow you. Like you might be like, I need my space or I need whatever, and they will follow you to the next room or they'll follow you through your space. And that can be very difficult.
Sure.
So yeah, thinking about what boundaries you can do, what you can commit to, what you can't, being very firm about it, being repetitive about it. Yeah, those types of things.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you a bit of a more mimi. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. This isn't a question. So I'll ask you something a bit different then, but kind of similar.
Yeah.
I genuinely believe that I interface with a decent number of schizophrenic people. Is there any possible way to
Oof.
have a conversation with somebody like that in a way that encourages them to seek help, or is that not possible? Or have you ever heard of any of the experiences that I've had, or maybe you think?
Yeah, no, for sure. Gosh, I listened to that one. So, like I feel like I have a healthy relationship with your content.
Okay, gotcha.
I generally listen to your YouTube videos. I don't really watch the streams.
Sure.
But yeah, man, I was listening to the one where you were reading out the letter that the person sent you. I, that just sucks because you're incredibly limited at what you can do. Folks who struggle with schizophrenia generally tend to prefer to be alone. Um, kind of the biggest pieces that pop up. I think a misnomer about schizophrenia is sort of like people seeing and hearing things. What's much more common is sort of like beliefs.
Yeah, feelings of either
Yeah,
persecution or paranoia or grandiosity or
right.
center of
And
big conspiracies. And yeah.
almost always follows the big three, which is God's alien and government. Um, People
Oh,
trying to
holy
take.
shit, I didn't even know that. That is so fucking true, though. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you never heard of that before?
No, but,
Yeah.
for people that email me, it's always like we're some form of like angel or angelic thing
Yeah.
or whatever, or that's a big
Right.
thing. The alien shit, the crop circle stuff, like random articles
Mm-hmm.
related to aliens doing this thing. And then government sometimes weaves into there, but the God and the alien one, I've seen that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And people trying to put thoughts into my head, people trying to take thoughts out of my head. There's cameras in my apartment. I know that they're in the light socket. That stuff is much more common than like other stuff. Folks who struggle with schizophrenia generally, I'm repeating myself, generally want to be alone, so they don't really want to be social. That's not everybody, but that's kind of the thing. And I don't envy your position as a streamer and a public person. Like, haven't said because there really isn't much. I mean, if you were to like, I could conceivably see you saying to somebody like, "Hey, I'm seeing some warning signs. Maybe you want to think about getting some help," and that person could be like, "Oh, they got to him as well."
Sure, yeah.
And that's not to belittle or undermine anybody who struggles with that. Again, it's a really rough condition. Medications can be very helpful, very, very helpful, if not necessary for folks who struggle with schizophrenia. Throwing that out there. Yeah, that's just not a good position for you to be in. That sucks.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so that was totally useless. Thanks. Sometimes
Yeah.
I interface with people, sometimes in adversarial ways.
Right.
And I feel like, I don't know if you heard any, I tell me to stop with this every. I hesitate to bring up specific examples because I don't want it to sound like I'm asking you as a professional in your professional capacity to evaluate anybody. So if you ever feel like I'm crossing that line, yeah, feel free to.
Disclaimer: pure entertainment.
Sure, sure. Well, yeah, but the disclaimer means nothing if we actually go
Right.
to those areas, right? Yeah. So I just want to make sure I'm being
Fair.
responsible. Yeah.
Fair.
There are people that I've interfaced with one person recently. If you haven't heard of them, I guess it helps me more because then I don't feel you have more of an attachment. That she basically claims that she's uncovered like a global gamer rape force. And she's like, she always says that she's in contact with, like, I've reported this to detectives, I'm in contact with these governments, and I know these people or whatever. And she is adversarial towards me. And it's hard to just say, like, hey, you're psychotic, get help. That doesn't seem to be very effective. Yeah, I'm curious when I have, because if it's just people that email me, it's whatever. But when you start to get into adversarial positions with people like this, it becomes more, now I have more of a prerogative to actually get this person to get help. Is there like a way to approach a conversation like that where you can like kind of gently massage a person towards seeking that kind of help? Is there any way to get them to realize that something might be off, or is that just an impossibility? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a rough one. I would say, yeah, like so. I guess from the liability standpoint, I would say you put it off to somebody, and what it would maybe as simple as having like a sheet of resources, that you could like somebody else would do about like, hey, I hear what you're saying. I hear that this is really important to you. Like, I'm a little concerned about some pieces, and here's some resources for things that you could get connected with in your local area. And again, it's just a tough one because it's like this person is seeking you out.
Well, unfortunately,
And
it's even a little bit more. It's like they're not only seeking me out, but they're seeking me out and then threatening to like destroy me by exposing me as part of
oh
like the global.
gosh,
And then combine that with kind of the political landscape where, for
yeah,
regardless of anybody's stance on it, yeah, if you have a woman saying that she's uncovered like a male rapist, a part of a global
yeah,
conspiracy, blah blah blah. Well, I think. Oh, I'm curious if you're talking about this. I've used the terms and some of the vernacular around schizophrenia quite a lot recently when I've interfaced with some people. But it might be the case that I'm always waiting for somebody to email like, "This is you're totally wrong on this. Is not that at all." If you ever feel that way, feel free to tell me. One of my I feel like something that bothers me with some people with certain whether we're talking about cluster B things or whether we're talking about schizophrenic people is people have this impression that these people wander the streets like zombies, sounding insane all the time. But it
sure,
feels like, in my experience, that in talking to, even with people with schizophrenia that have some of these delusions, that if you're just having a normal conversation or if certain topics don't come up, they actually sound incredibly lucid and super normal and super sane. They don't actually sound out there all the time, depending on where the
yeah,
topics go. Yeah, does that feel
real
accurate? Or
people.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and I think that to that effect, like I think that yeah, I would say that one of the things that I think is important is just like moving away from pathologizing as much as we can.
for sure.
And so even if it's like to the point of like being able to compartmentalize, like, this might be a little bit of the schizophrenic pieces coming out, but this is the real person right here. I think it's kind of like a much more compassionate way of viewing some of those things. Um,
I agree with the compassionate part. So I'm coming at
yeah.
this more selfishly, though. So my issue is when I spoke to this person initially, I knew a
Yeah.
lot of background information about them, but I didn't let that on. We had about a 2 hour conversation. For the first hour, I didn't breach any of the topics that I knew would kind of trigger some of the crazier things that this, I don't like to say crazy. Some of the more delusional sounds like an insult too, though, but I didn't entertain any of their delusions or go into those topics. And for the first hour, the person sounded like incredibly intelligent. Like my whole chat loved this person. They're like, oh, this person's, yeah, this is super true. Like they're really smart. They're
Okay.
into this. And it wasn't until I breached some of the more particular topics that I knew would kind of trigger their responses, then everybody was like, whoa, this person is absolutely out there. So it's a little bit frightening to me that somebody with that level of delusion could theoretically present a story to somebody and come off as incredibly lucid the entire time. And then if it ever comes back to me, I'm left saying, well, okay, listen, I know they sounded smart, but this person is like schizophrenic, right? It makes me sound like I'm just, I don't want to use the term crazy making, but it sounds like I'm actually doing that. Like, oh, no, trust me, that person's crazy. So I guess,
Well, I guess my
yeah,
question would be like, what is the concern there? Because when we talk about like, I think schizophrenia is very much one of those things that ideally would be destigmatized quite a bit.
for
Like,
sure.
you could hear doctors and teachers and like all kinds of folks who might maybe struggle with schizophrenia and are kind of going about their lives managing it. What would you say the concern is that you're
The
having?
concern would be this person presents a pretty compelling story to other
Okay.
people that I am like part of a big rape conspiracy and I'm covering it up and banning her from places to try to silence her, uncovering that basically. And because she sounds like relatively lucid and everything, it comes off as being pretty legitimate. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. So they're saying they.
I'm glad it's
It's not.
entertaining to
It's
you, but
not.
yeah.
It's not funny. It's
Okay.
not funny. But
Yeah.
I feel like you're saying like they're lucidly expressing that I'm part of a rape cabal.
Basically, yeah.
Sorry
Or
about the
that
R
I'm
word.
that I'm being
Yeah,
complicit in covering it up essentially. Yeah.
yeah. Which sounds somewhat like an oxymoron. Lucidly describing it. Yeah, it's oof. Well, and I would say like, uh, you know more about this stuff than I do.
Hmm.
Like, what boundaries do you feel like you need to set, and what makes it hard to do so?
Well, so this is the issue that I have as a public figure,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
right.
I have been gifted with extreme resilience. Um, I'll marvelize myself here, okay? So I have Batman syndrome, right? I can deal with anything. I'm fine. I don't give a fuck
Right.
about anything. But the problem then is that when I have adversarial relationships with some people and they realize that, then they start targeting people around me. And now all of a
Yeah.
sudden, my boundaries aren't enough.
Yeah.
I might not care what this person ever says about me or what they said to other people. I don't give a fuck. But
Yeah.
I do care what my surrounding group of people think about me. And if they start reaching out to those people, my boundaries are now insufficient to deal with that. And it becomes a very difficult
Yeah.
situation to deal with. Yeah.
And that's a terrible one, and unfortunately, I don't have much feedback on that one because
It's
that
kind of a
is
unique.
it's extraordinary,
Yeah.
and I mean that sort of like in the proper sense, like it's an extraordinary circumstance that your average person would not have to deal with.
Because ordinarily you
Um,
can just not talk to a person and your life is
right.
much more compartmentalized, if it's a bad
Yeah, and
coworker
the
or
and the
whatever.
reaching out to people in your personal life, like
Hmm.
just to say it out loud, it probably doesn't need to be able to do it anyway. Like that's a pretty significant boundary violation.
Hmm.
And if that's happening, like obviously huge red flags.
Yeah.
Um, but hard.
Oh, here, I guess here's like a general. I always like
Yeah,
to get this type of feedback. I have my own thoughts, but I think it's good for people to hear. And maybe I
yeah.
improve my thing. How do you decide for yourself what is a healthy personal boundary versus what is an unreasonable expectation for me to burden someone else with? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm laughing because I feel like I know where this this one comes from.
Well, wait, maybe you might not know actually. So
Oh,
I'll
okay,
say,
maybe not.
in a public sense, this might come from the one girl that I've dealt with who obviously seems like she has unreasonable boundaries. But I'll say in a
Yeah,
personal sense, the way that I engage with people sexually, romantically, and on a friendship
yeah,
level. I have certain expectations that I have for my personal relationships, but then like I'll have people tell me like this is not realistic. Like you are mind fucking people or you're drawing people into relationships that are untenable, like, or they can't maintain these. And so
yeah.
I kind of have to sit back sometimes and wonder, like, do I have like unreasonable expectations for people? Or is the way that I approach things like, yeah, I'm curious. I'm not asking you, I guess, for a therapy session, but like, how do you, yeah, how would, yeah, I'm sorry.
Let's crack this open. No,
Yeah,
no, no, no.
but I'm
I'm
curious
gonna
because
give opinions on this.
yeah, go for it. Yeah. How do you decide like, okay, this is a reasonable boundary versus this is like a super unreasonable boundary? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say a big thing is if you're comfortable walking away, because I
Okay,
feel
but
like
this
that
is
is.
okay. Fuck. So this is the one I have to push
Uh,
back on. I am this is because this is my standard response. Because anytime
uh-huh.
somebody gives me this thing where they're like, "I don't think this is fair," my number one response is like, oh, "Okay, well then fucking leave. I don't give a fuck." So, but I feel like that's probably is that. Do you really think that's like the healthiest way to? Because I can cut and leave on any situation. I don't give a fuck.
Here's
But
the thing.
yeah.
You are allowed to be a jerk. You're allowed to be mean.
Okay.
You're allowed to be unkind. And if that works for you, like, and this sounds like this might sound like I'm talking trash right now. I really
Hmm.
don't. I don't mean that. But it's sort of like my boundaries are important,
Sure.
and it exists to protect me,
Sure.
and hopefully the people around me as well. But first and foremost, it exists to protect me. And so if somebody is sort of like pushing that boundary, this is actually something that will pop up in session a fair amount with other people, which is like you can learn a lot about somebody
Hmm.
by how they treat your boundaries.
I agree with that to some
Yeah,
extent, but then it's weird because I feel like I'm playing devil's advocate against myself. So,
you are. It's
yeah,
weird.
sure. So the thing though is that like we can probably agree that there exists unreasonable boundaries, right?
Yeah,
So we'll say I'll use an extreme one. My boundary is that if we're going to be friends, I'm going to constantly call you the N word. That's my boundary, right? Now
sure.
that's a boundary that I might set that I genuinely feel comfortable with, and it makes me happy, and blah blah blah. But I imagine that if we had a session and I talked about this boundary and, I'm okay not having very many friends and I don't because of this boundary. And, I imagine I would imagine you would say something like, okay, well, maybe this is a boundary that we don't need, that doesn't serve a greater purpose. That's not a healthy boundary. Like, yeah. Or would you just say whatever boundary you want, you can.
No, you talk about the idea of sort of like violating other people's boundaries as a problem, things that pop up with like too much closeness. So when we're too close to people, we run the risk of sort of like violating their boundaries. Like, oh, I'm comfortable talking about these things, so you must be as well. Um, and there is a component of that of like acceptance. So it's sort of like if I accept the outcomes, then we're kind of done here. But if I don't accept the outcomes, then that's important because a big thing to think about is like if this is not a problem, then why are we talking about it? Like
Sure,
if
I
you're
understand. Yeah.
comfortable accepting the outcome of an action, then we're done here.
So then the
But
question would be, do
yeah,
you feel like your boundaries are causing you to be unhappy by, let's say that we have a boundary that drives people away from us. Well, is that
right,
upsetting to you? If it's not, then okay. Yeah. All right.
yeah, um, yeah, and I'm not gonna I am not going to give you feedback.
Sure. That's fine. All
But
right.
that would be, yeah, like if something is rubbing a person the wrong way, like I don't like these outcomes, well, then it's worth investigating. But if you're fine with the outcomes, then you're fine with the outcomes. Which, is always like, again, kind of going back to it a little bit, is a curiosity that I have, when I listen to folks, and I kind of get it, I suppose, but I just sort of feel sometimes like, boy, man, it is really tough for folks to leave. Um,
Yeah.
and,
Holy shit.
yeah, and I'm not talking about like yours. We just recapped this, so I don't want to hit it again. Not talking about your situation, like where you're kind of trapping a public person, but just in general, like man, it can be really tough for people to leave.
Yeah.
It's like
So
you
something.
set your boundary, now walk away, now go. But I get it; it's hard. That's not lost on me how hard that is.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that I mentioned before in my early 20s. I take that for granted because it's very easy for me to cut when I feel like it's not working for me anymore. But then obviously with my relationship with Melina, most people I don't think can do that, or it seems to be the case. It's very hard for me to understand that type of thought process where people will stick around in negative situations. But I understand that it happens, and there must be some, whether it's maladaptive or whether it's like ordinary healthy social human behavior. Yeah, it seems like it's very difficult for a lot of people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's reasons why we break up with people, and there's reasons why friendships end, and some of those get to be acceptable. And I would say, like, we talked about like the safety. The other big two when it comes to boundaries are like flexibility and connectedness. So, like, can I be flexible when I need to be flexible? It would be a thing that a person might talk about.
Sure.
Hopefully, this was a positive experience with a mental health person as opposed to some of the stranger ones you've had. Between myself and the last fella you talked to. Hopefully that's
Yeah, he was really cool too. Yeah.
changing perceptions as well.
Gotcha. Oh yeah, true. We need those more positive perceptions of. Yeah.
Awesome. Right on. Well, thank you so much, and you have a good night.
Yep. Have a good one.
23rd century, you are respected for your abilities, regardless of what you do or wear.
However, I should say it was really interesting researching this because I actually found in Nichelle Nichols' book, Beyond Uhura, her autobiography, that she had this really interesting anecdote about costume designer Bill Theus, who wasn't a fan of the sexy costumes.
Thias had a fit whenever the script called for a curvaceous actress, especially when that meant fitting her into something appropriately sexy. Judging by some of those revealing outfits, you might deduce that Bill Thias enjoyed working with the female form. Hardly. In fact, Bill Thias preferred girls who looked like boys.
In case you weren't able to pick up on what Nichelle Nichols was trying to lay down there, Bill Theus was gay. And Nichols within the book basically alludes to the fact that a lot of these skimpy outfits were created at the behest of Gene Roddenberry, not Bill Theus. But I am by no means an expert when it comes to discussing costumes, so I reached out to my friend who is, Sarah, over at the Costume Codex.
Hi, Jesse. So any discussion of sexiness in Star Trek is probably going to bring up those original series costumes that are camp as Christmas and oh so horny.
Problem, Captain?
And the man behind those costumes, William Ware Theus. And his work on Star Trek is so iconic that he has an entire theory named after him. The Theus-tilation theory, and it holds that the eroticism of any garment is proportional to how likely it is to just sort of fall off.
Gentlemen.
It's that the potential for nudity is much sexier than just a naked person. But as titillating as Theus's costumes were, apparently Jean would adjust things now and then to just make it that much more likely to expose something that shouldn't be exposed.
I'd like some historical information about your ship.
Now, we tend to think of Theus's work in terms of titillating with the female form. It was the 60s, things were very binary, and the gaze was expected to go one way. But that's not actually the way that Theus's gaze inclined. And when he had the chance to work with the male form, he did enjoy doing that.
We knew that. You are interesting in many ways.
And this is where we get in TNG, when he worked on the first season, we get Angel 1, for example, that gives us the very sexy exposed bare chest of one Riker.
I gotta say, it's kind of sexy.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Actually, it feels quite comfortable.
It's a pre-beard Riker, but looks pretty bare to me.
How handsome you look.
Thank you.
And then there was his work on the episode Justice. I think we have to call these garments clothing, because I don't know what else we might call them.
Watch, I bet you can't do this.
Unfortunately, we only got one season of Theus's Next Generation creations. Like a lot of gay men of his generation, he would succumb to the AIDS virus. But his legacy lives on. In every costume that looks like the character could be disrobed by a stiff breeze. And one can imagine that Jean might be there as well, just nudging things along.
Men are not objects to be possessed, Mistress Beata.
Of course they're not. It was merely a figure of speech.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. And by the way, all of you should totally check out Sarah's wonderful channel. She's done some amazing deep dives on the thematics of costumes in shows like Babylon 5 and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And she's also just an awesome person. And by the way, her Bajoran cosplay in that video was freaking on point. So y'all better go subscribe to her. I'll be very upset if you don't.
In the end, Star Trek was one of the sexiest shows on the air at the time. As later Star Trek movie producer Harv Bennett put it,
"What I saw that I liked about Star Trek were the relationships between the three men and the sense of male bonding and family and the ethics, the morality. Though there are times and episodes when Trek was as kinky a show as ever came down the pike."
If we look at the characters, Captain Kirk was being placed into numerous flimsy romances every single week, getting to make out with a new girl or have a new love interest on every episode. However, while Kirk has certainly earned a reputation as a ladies' man, a reputation that would later greatly inform Chris Pine's incarnation of the character in Star Trek 2009 and Into Darkness especially, these romances of the week for William Shatner's Kirk were more of a product of the show's episodic format and the time at which the show was made and what was thought of science fiction. That there needed to be a girl for the main character to smooch up with every single week in a series. You saw it in things like the westerns that were constantly being filmed at the same time as Star Trek.
TV shows at this time also were rarely thought of as having continuity episode to episode, so Kirk having multiple romances over a course of several episodes wasn't really all that shocking because each of these stories were considered to be independent from each other with just the same characters happening to be in each episode.
I was hoping to make you forget about this today.
Doesn't hurt anymore.
While Kirk certainly made out with his fair share of a few girls, he honestly seemed to be more in love with the Enterprise itself than anyone else.
This vessel I give, she takes. She won't permit me my life. I've got to live hers.
Something that was made more explicit in the movies, given that there's literally a whole sequence of Kirk staring at the Enterprise like the handsome lady that she is in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Gene Roddenberry even made this more clear in his novelization of that movie, stating that Kirk basically got a hard-on for the Enterprise more than any girl he had ever met.
She hung there inside the lacy filigree of the orbital dock. Enterprise. Kirk's eyes saw only her. It was as if the delicate latticework structure around the starship did not exist, or, if he was aware of the dry dock at all, he saw it and its lights as bejeweled space sculpture existing only to frame and highlight the symmetry and beauty of the Enterprise. Was she like a lovely woman? No. At this moment, she was more than that to him. A fable? A myth come alive? Yes, that was it. She was as Aphrodite must have been when Zeus raised her up from the sea, naked and shockingly beautiful. Jesse, is Kirk going to fuck the Enterprise?
Kirk was also marketed as the sexy leading man, especially towards the start of the show. He would constantly rip open his shirt, exposing his chest, which I'm sure it all wasn't to show off all the oil that they had placed onto it. Yet to William Shatner's dismay, Kirk's more typical bravado sexuality was often overshadowed by Leonard Nimoy's Spock, who was becoming the breakout star of the show, and his emotionless Vulcan quickly turned into a burgeoning sex symbol around the country. Which, I mean, can you really blame anyone? I mean, look at those, those ears. His ears. Nothing else about Leonard Nimoy. Also, sidetrack here, why does every adult actor that plays Spock really fucking hot? Leonard Nimoy, Zachary Quinto, Ethan Peck. Whew, I'm okay.
I assure you, Doctor, I'm quite all right. The pain was momentary. It passed quickly.
Anyways, Spock's stoic attitude appealed to many women at the time, more so than the Horatio Hornblower type of sexuality that Kirk embodied. That seemed to play more on the male fantasy insert rather than a female-led fantasy.
It's also worth noting that many of Gene Roddenberry's collaborators often noted that he regularly identified with his leads like Kirk, often describing both in person and in scripts how these characters would sweep in and get the sexually displayed lady.
Roddenberry's depiction of women in scripts would often be introduced by the size of their breasts, and their smoldering but noticeable passion for the leading man.
However, as Spock was initially given less romantic interest on the show, fans started to find implicit sexual tension with those who he did have a strong emotional relationship on the series with, namely Captain Kirk.
And you serve Captain Kirk. Do you like him?
The question is irrelevant.
But you are subordinate to Captain Kirk's orders, even to his whims.
My duty as an officer is to obey him.
Now, I'm not going to focus on this too much because I've done a whole another video on it that I'll link up above, but Spock's relationship with Kirk even helped spawn the modern-day /fiction shipping movement, with numerous fan fictions and art being made of the sword pairing that never got to actually flourish on screen despite certain very obvious hints to it.
Something wrong?
A kink in my back. That's it. A little higher. Push hard. Take it in there, Mr. Smith. Thank you, Yellow. That's sufficient.
It's a matter of who is looking at it, from what perspective, and from the perspective of gay people. Seeing that is eye-opening. They see the gay passion, the gay attraction, and the gay anguish depicted in those scenes.
It isn't every first officer who gets to belt as captain several times.
Even further, sex often became the textual focus of the series through Spock himself, where we learn that Vulcans, or Vulcanians as they were sometimes known back then because, you know, canon has always been weird in Star Trek, that Vulcans go through a sort of heat every 7 years, needing to return to Vulcan to bone.
A process called Pon farr, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes.
There's no need to be embarrassed about it, Mr. Spock. It happens to the birds and the bees.
The birds and the bees are not Vulcans, Captain.
I love Star Trek. And this unrepentant, clearly sexual storyline was certainly new for television at the time, even coded as it was in alien psychology. Its representation of a horny as fuck Vulcan was not lost on many in the audience, such as Gizmodo writer Evan Naris.
30 years gone, I can still remember how Spock's feeling of shame and later anger resonated with my teenage self. I wasn't ever going to fight over a woman like he and Kirk did in this episode, but I recognized the fervor that the Vulcan was enthralled to. I knew there was a reason for the hair-trigger randiness I was dealing with, and I knew what I was supposed to do with these urges. But release seemed light years away, and any effort to, divert my ship to Vulcan would expose my desperation to people that I didn't want to know. What Amok Time communicated to me was the primal urgency of libido. Spock felt betrayed by his body's core programming. And so did I.
Spock would feature in numerous other romantic storylines down the line as his character became more popular, including an ongoing one with the demure Nurse Chapel, who was played by Majel Barrett after her initial character Una was cut out of the pilot. Nurse Chapel would constantly pine after the Vulcan, with Spock being like, not really, I'm not really into you. It's fine. Sorry.
Oh, I love you. Sorry.
Captain is en route engineering, Mr. Spock. Can you take the bridge? Acknowledge.
I am sorry.
I can relate to Nurse Chapel. I can relate very hard. But moving beyond Spock, let's not forget things like the penis rock. Never forget the penis rock. That is Star Trek canon. Penis rocks. But jokes aside though, Roddenberry was so in love with sex on Star Trek that after Star Trek was cancelled, he helped to make a very famous behind-the-scenes record called Inside Star Trek, where he included a bit that he wrote on that record where he got to interview Sarek, Spock's father, about how Vulcans fucked.
Welcome, Ambassador Sarek.
My old friend Roddenberry. It's been years since we met.
And I have many new questions, Ambassador. Much more intimate and personal than I've ever had to ask before.
About my son, Spock, I presume.
Well, yes, if you include the beginnings of Spock. There are some things I must know, Ambassador, in order to continue my Star Trek journals. Forgive me, but how were you able to overcome the Vulcan Pon farr mating drive? I presume you did overcome it, since Spock's mother, Amanda, was human, and somehow she was impregnated by you.
Roddenberry, are you asking if we coupled?
Yes, sir. We know that Vulcans normally mate only once every 7 years.
And since it is known that we pay for our sexual repressions during these years by an almost animal madness, this has aroused a prurient curiosity among humans.
But if you take the madness which happens to your people at the time of Pon farr, then add to it the extraordinary strength of a Vulcan.
Ordinarily, an Earth woman could not enjoy that. If she survived, she might be severely injured, both physically and emotionally.
Regarding that...
Roddenberry, I will not paint a word picture.
Yeah, that segment's fucking real. Wild, isn't it? Imagine being the great Mark Leonard, the actor who played Sarek, and you get a call from your friend Gene Roddenberry who says he wants you to do this nice little cameo for this weird little Star Trek record thing he's doing, and you show up and suddenly you're talking about Vulcans getting laid. Gene Roddenberry's vision, everyone. Gene Roddenberry's vision. As should be obvious by now, sex was an integral part of Star Trek, as the Enterprise itself was, right from the very start. And as I said, this was deeply important to a show that was aiming to show a brighter future for humanity. Star Trek the original series is by no means a utopia as many claim it was supposed to be, but it was certainly a future for humanity that was positive and hopeful. And sexual freedom was an extension of that and was always welcomed and an important part of that story. A future where we didn't have to have this constant shame at using and seeing our bodies. This would continue for most of Star Trek under Gene Roddenberry. While Star Trek was cancelled in 1969, it would soon become deeply popular in reruns. When Star Trek was eventually in discussions for being brought back to TV in the late 70s in the form of Star Trek Phase 2, Roddenberry tried to fight for the show to continue to have a lot of sex, with folks casually boning often around the ship. There was gonna be a boning room on the Enterprise, because why not? This is the future. Have your fucking boning rooms. So why are we thinking so hard about this? Have your boning rooms in the future. I want it. Give it to me, Star Trek Discovery. Eventually though, Star Trek Phase 2 was turned into Star Trek the Motion Picture after the success of Star Wars, which is the only movie in the Star Trek franchise that Roddenberry had a ton of direct involvement in. And it's also the horniest sci-fi movie you've ever actually seen without actually having any sex in it.
I have successfully penetrated the next chamber of the alien's interior.
Because I talk about this stuff way too often, I've already done a whole video on the sexual undertones of Star Trek the Motion Picture, so I won't rehash it here, I just tell you to go watch that video. It's a bit old, but I'm still proud of it and I think the point still stands. But to give you a short version, just think of V'ger, the giant machine trying to destroy Earth in the movie. Think about how it's essentially coded to be a giant space vagina, and Enterprise, well...
Fertilization is the epic story of a single sperm facing incredible odds to unite with an egg and form a new human life.
I'm just saying, the Enterprise is a sperm.
The sperm must pass through the cervix, an opening into the uterus.
Hey, what's going on here?
Well, these goofballs had never heard of a menstrual period, and I was trying to tell them.
And he didn't know what he was talking about either.
Yeah.
Okay, simmer down. Have a seat. I brought some charts.
We also have characters in that movie saying things like this.
My oath of celibacy is on record, Captain. May I assume my duties?
Valiance.
Which apparently is only there to ensure that we very much know that she's really good at sex, so much so that she has to let everyone know that she's not going to have sex with them. In fact, in the novelization of the movie that Roddenberry himself wrote, we learn that her species, the Deltans, are so good at sex that they drive people crazy and distract human men just with their pheromones. Numerous times throughout the novel, Kirk must push through bravely and ignore her pheromones to be the strong captain that we know him to be.
Deltan pheromones were still felt by them, and an unsuspecting human was likely to find himself in considerable sexual excitement without understanding why. It could be troublesome aboard a vessel, but it was usually worth it since Deltan were superb navigators. Alea's aura of sensuality surprised even Kirk, even though he had been warned and prepared himself for it. She somehow felt naked to him, despite her complete, correct Starship Lieutenant's uniform. Kirk concentrated on handling the situation with suitable formality. He could feel the pheromones working on him and decided not to rise. He was, after all, the ship's captain.
He's so manly that he's not gonna ever have sex with her. He's not gonna let her distract him from his beautiful lady, the Enterprise.
I wish I could kiss her and squeeze her. Excuse me?
I say beautiful lady, I meant handsome lady. I'm sorry. I'm very offended. I'm very offended at myself now. There's also a few other choice passages from the novel, such as when Kirk meets the female admiral at the start of the book.
He could almost catch the scent of her body fragrance, and he could feel the slight pressure of his genitals responding to those memories. She had been perfection. Lover, friend, wife, mother, and in every other role and joy she supplied as he slowly recovered from the fatigue and emotional wounds of those 5 long years.
All that, by the way, is describing one female admiral that Kirk meets for about like 2 minutes within the book, and it takes up 2 pages of him just going off about how much he wants to fuck her. Like, it's just them talking over a hologram, and Kirk's just like, well, I can't not think about boning her. She's a woman in front of me. She may not be the Enterprise, but I still got needs. Oh, by the way, it's important to know that Roddenberry's novel had hologram communication, so if any nerds think that Star Trek Discovery having holograms ruins Gene's vision of the future, the novelization that Gene Roddenberry wrote tells you to suck it. But these passages from this novel also start to highlight a problem, doesn't it? This objectification gets more pronounced later in the book, where the Deltan pilot Ilea, who I talked about earlier, is killed and replaced with a non-sentient probe from V'ger who looks just like her. In the movie, that probe slowly regains sentience from being around her former boyfriend, Captain Decker. But in the novel, it's revealed that it's not just Decker's presence that brings her back to sentience, it's the fact that Decker quite literally fucks the non-sentient probe back to sentience.
It was like Alea coming alive in front of him. Spock had been right. It was so perfect a duplicate that even the thought patterns of Alea's brain had been reproduced. Could it possibly be more than that? It was sent by the intruders. Any consciousness in there would have to be theirs. Then I'll still be making contact with them. Isn't that what we want? Hands which had ripped through a Durasteel door were caressing him now. Or were they plucking the clothing from his body? He knew he was alone. With Alea? Or with V'ger? Which are you? What are you? The probe signals were growing more and more erratic, and now the carbon-based unit seemed to be attacking V'ger's probe, whose signals had peaked into random nonsense. Puzzling. V'ger's own probe resisting V'ger's control over it.
I'll be honest, I've gotten some good dick in my life, but no dick was so good that it literally knocked me into sentience. Maybe out of sentience, but not into sentience. No dick's that good. This is the utopian future, I guess. But all of this makes it very clear that Roddenberry often saw women characters as more objects for sex, what they could do for men, rather than having agency in their sexuality themselves. Now, that's what I say, but Gene Roddenberry, however, would disagree. In his later years after Star Trek was cancelled, Gene Roddenberry would often try to argue that it was equally balanced.
You cannot write in science fiction, you certainly cannot read it very much and deal in these terms across whole galaxies without realizing that sexual equality is as basic as any other kind of equality. This does not mean that in future pictures I will ever stop using women as sex objects, because I will not. But to be fair, we have always used and will be continuing to use males as sex objects too. As a matter of fact, when I was younger and much more agile, I've been used as a sex object myself. I think it's great fun.
And on the surface, this appears to be true. I mean, men were certainly added for sex appeal on the series. Zulu once danced around with his shirt off in a truly beautiful sequence. In season 2, Walter Koenig joined the cast based solely on his looks as a rock star like the Monkees, though his Russian character Chekhov was also a welcome addition to the series that was made in the heights of the Cold War. So certainly, male sex appeal was there. But just to say that would be completely missing what it means to be sexually objectified. You see, all the men within Star Trek had full agency and access to their sexual urges on the show. Kirk always had the option whether to pursue or turn down a girl. Spock, while certainly involved in at least 2 stories where he became emotionally entangled with a woman due to viruses or spores, was always still able to consent and turn down those relationships.
I can't lose you now, Mr. Spock. I can't.
I have a responsibility to this ship.
Chekhov also was always written to be given more sexual agency.
I went to his house, and he proceeded to show me some memos he had written for the guys at NBC. And all the memos were very positive, saying, let's involve Chekhov more. He has appeal. Let's bring him down to the planets more. Involve him with members of the opposite sex.
Chekhov, like the other guys, got to have the ability to get involved with women.
There is nothing wrong in doing what you want.
Conversely though, this sexual agency was never afforded to the women on the show. Very often, women didn't have agency in their libido or when they got to have sex, or control over those sexual situations when they entered into them. For example, we have episodes like Charlie X, where the titular Charlie lusts after Human Rand, even smacking her once on the butt.
You got a deal, friend.
While this is framed as bad within the show itself, with Charlie being a boy going through puberty who hasn't learned much about how to have relationships with women yet, it's still an episode that focuses entirely on the sexual desirability of Rand by Charlie.
Well, I did that to her. She didn't like it. She said you'd explain it to me.
Me? I see. Well, there are things you can do with a lady, Charlie, that you... there's no right way to hit a woman.
In the episode What Are Little Girls Made Of, a mad scientist Corby has literally made a robotic girlfriend that he dresses revealing while implying that he made her for sex, while he gets to prance around in a fully clothed outfit.
Even further, in that same episode, Kirk just overwhelms this poor female android with a simple kiss.
No. Not programmed for you.
In another episode, Kirk threatens a planetary leader with a spanking.
If I touch you again, your glory, it'll be to administer an ancient Earth custom called a spanking.
Because women, right? They just need a good spanking. I mean, to be fair, I'm always down for a good spanking, but not in this context. Not to mention all the time that women just get, just so frightened by all the scary stuff happening in space.
Captain, I'm frightened.
We also have episodes like The Wolf in the Fold, where Scotty is taken over by an alien entity that used to be Jack the Ripper, and it forces him to go around killing women. Also, apparently, in this episode, we even learn that even before he met the entity, Scotty had a lot of rage towards women.
Don't forget, the explosion that threw Scotty against the bulkhead was caused by a woman.
Physically, he's all right. Am I right in assuming that?
Oh, yes. And matter of fact, considerable psychological damage could have been caused. For example, his total resentment toward women.
Keep that in mind, because that aspect of things might be reflected in a certain person that we're also talking about in real life.
Additionally, a recurring theme in all of Roddenberry's world building, as I've already kind of alluded to earlier in this video, is that he liked to talk about different alien species' sexual proclivities, such as with the wonderful Vulcanians. And even there, this sexual objectification of women does kind of come up.
This probably led to a need for hypnosis as a part of the sex act, and we may gather from time to time that love on Spock's planet has a somewhat more violent quality than Earth's aesthetics permit mankind to enjoy.
Violence and hypnosis were, to Roddenberry, part of Vulcan culture when it came to sex. While consensual violence and pain can be a healthy part of sex, the hypnosis thing really comes down to, again, feeling like a sexual male fantasy thing. The few women who do seem to have agency in their sexual abilities throughout Star Trek the original series, though, often turn out to be tricksters, the femme fatale, luring men into sex with them to kill them or get something from them. This is a very often used sexist trope with a long history in visual media that highlights the dangers of female sexuality. Hell, we see this in the very first episode that ever aired on television of Star Trek, The Man Trap. I mean, it's in the name, where we see a salt vampire take on the form of different women in order to seduce them to their deaths. In the episode Amok Time, Spock's assigned mate T'Pring tries to manipulate Spock's sexual urges in order to get him killed so she can marry her true love.
There was also Stan, who wanted very much to be my consort, and I wanted him. If your captain were Victor, he would not want me, and so I would have Stan. If you were Victor, you would free me because I had dared to challenge, and again I would have Stan. But if you did not free me, it would be the same, for you would be gone, and I would have your name and your property, and Stan would still be there.